Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the unpredictable waters of Viking history, so hold on to your horned helmets. Now, we're not talking about the Hollywood kind of Vikings with all the swords and wild hair. No, I mean the real Vikings, the ones who spent half their time trying to find new lands to conquer, and the other half trying not to freeze to death. But before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Seriously, no pressure. And while you're at it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many of you are out there at 2 a.m., just like me. Now dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soothing white noise, and get comfortable, preferably with your feet tucked in, because you never know what might nibble on them tonight. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to sail the vast, unforgiving ocean with nothing but the stars to guide you? How about crashing into what you thought was an uncharted land? Or maybe you've daydreamed about settling on a frozen shore, hoping you packed enough fur for the winter. Ever tried building a settlement with nothing but timber and sheer willpower? And who's the genius that decided to put down roots in Newfoundland of all places? Now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1000, and you're a Viking staring out at the rugged coast of North America. Welcome to Lance aux Meadows. It's cold, it's wild, and you've got a lot of work ahead of you. Imagine waking up one morning, wandering into the great expanse of the Newfoundland wilderness, and stumbling upon a Viking settlement, complete with timber structures and iron tools. This isn't a dream, but a real discovery made in 1960, forever changing the way we think about pre-Columbus America. How did the Vikings, those brave, bearded adventurers, manage to navigate their longships across the Atlantic and settle in what would become a Canadian outpost? It's almost as if they showed up, built their little village, and then decided, hey, this is fine, and left it all behind. No big deal. But the truth? Well, that's far stranger than any, oh, look, there's a Viking settlement in Canada story could ever be. So let's start by getting one thing straight. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon this place in their drunken seafaring stupor, like your uncle at Thanksgiving looking for the bathroom. No, these were sophisticated navigators. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of an expansive coastline, staring out at the ocean, and you realize you're about to embark on the journey of a lifetime. You've got nothing but a boat, a crew of tough-as-nails Vikings, and some seriously questionable judgment. But they didn't just blindly sail into the unknown. Oh no, they were strategizing, using the sun, the stars, and even mysterious sailing stones, yes, rocks, that helped them find their way. These sea warriors set out from Greenland and Iceland, and they sailed all the way to Newfoundland, at least 1,000 years before Columbus ever thought about setting foot in the Americas. You might wonder, how did they even know where to go? Well, you know how modern explorers have GPS and maps on their phones? Yeah, the Vikings didn't have that. What they did have, though, was an incredible understanding of the world around them. They didn't need a Wi-Fi signal to find their way. With their famous longships, designed for both deep and shallow waters, they could navigate rough seas with precision. And while you're sitting in your warm house, probably thinking of 1,000 reasons why you wouldn't take a boat into the unknown, these Vikings were simply living on the edge. They weren't just looking for treasure, they were looking to explore, to carve out a future in lands untouched by anyone else. Now let's get to the part that really gets the imagination going. Lance aux Meadows. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 1000 and looking around at this wild, untamed land, an environment so different from your homeland of Iceland or Greenland. There's something about the air, something about the way the wind smells that says, yeah, you're not in Kansas anymore. But these Vikings were no strangers to the wilderness. They had already faced the icy, barren landscapes of their own lands, so this place wasn't exactly unfamiliar. It was cold, rugged, and full of potential for those who could withstand its challenges. The Vikings didn't just put up tents or slap together a few makeshift huts. They built timber structures that were expertly crafted to withstand the elements. Their houses weren't just places to sleep, they were homes built to endure. These buildings were timber-framed with sod roofs, a perfect match for the landscape. And if you're picturing thatched roofs and small cabins, think again. These were proper Viking homes, designed for practicality and strength, not something you'd expect to fall down after one good gust of wind. They even built a forge, where blacksmithing tools and iron goods were made, a definite sign of permanence. These weren't just adventurers passing through, they were settlers, intent on making a go of it in this strange new world. But let's talk about the discovery itself. In 1960, a Canadian archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anstein Ingstad, were the ones to stumble upon these remarkable ruins. They weren't looking for a Viking settlement specifically. They were simply on a mission to uncover Newfoundland's past. But what they uncovered was something that would rewrite the history books. As they began to excavate the site, they found timber remains, iron nails, and other artifacts that immediately pointed to the possibility that they had discovered the remnants of an ancient Viking settlement. The realization, Vikings, had been here long before anyone else. And this wasn't just any ordinary discovery, it was the first known Viking site in North America. Imagine that moment of realization. There, buried under centuries of soil and grass, was the proof that the Vikings had made it to the New World long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So what happened? Did the Vikings decide to put down roots in this cold, remote area for the long haul? Unfortunately, the settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows wasn't exactly a success story. It's unclear why the Vikings abandoned the site, but theories abound. Perhaps it was because the land was too harsh and unforgiving. Maybe the indigenous peoples of the area didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for the visitors. Or perhaps it was simply a matter of the Vikings moving on to other, more promising opportunities. Regardless of the reasons, L'Anse aux Meadows was eventually abandoned, leaving behind a curious reminder of a world that might have been. But here's the kicker. The Vikings didn't just discover a piece of land, they created a bridge between worlds. They interacted with the indigenous peoples, traded with them, and even, according to some accounts, fought with them. The Vikings left their mark, however briefly, on the history of North America. They didn't just sail across the ocean in search of treasure and glory. They navigated the unknown in search of something bigger, a legacy. So, as you settle in for the night, think about those Vikings, their incredible journeys across the open sea, their ability to adapt and survive in an unforgiving land, and their courage to settle on the shores of a continent that was, at the time, far beyond the reaches of any known world. In a world where exploration was often reserved for the daring, the Vikings took risks that shaped the course of history. And though they didn't leave behind an empire or a new world order, their brief foray into North America forever changed the way we view our history, reminding us that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from what we find, but from the stories we uncover along the way. And next time you find yourself complaining about your commute or the Wi-Fi dropping, just remember, the Vikings did it with nothing but a longship, some iron nails, and a whole lot of courage. Before you even think about packing your bags for a Viking voyage, picture this. You're stepping onto a boat carved from the bones of ancient trees, the sturdy longship that could slice through stormy seas like butter. With no GPS, no compass, and no Google Maps, how in the world did these Norsemen figure out how to cross an ocean? Tonight, we'll take a long, hard look at these remarkable boats. Boats so advanced they practically redefined what it meant to travel across the ocean. Now, imagine you're aboard one of these vessels, the salty sea breeze in your hair, and absolutely no idea what's going to happen next. But hey, no pressure. First, let's talk about the design of these ships, because honestly, it's mind-blowing. If you've ever tried to put together IKEA furniture and felt like throwing yourself into the nearest fjord, just imagine building something as complex and finely tuned as a Viking longship using nothing but primitive tools and apparently a lot of patience. The longship wasn't just a boat, it was a work of art. Picture this. It was around 75 feet long, maybe even longer, and as thin as a pencil on the water. It had a sleek, slender hull that made it fast and nimble. Think of it like the Lamborghini of the sea, except instead of zooming down a highway, it was cutting through choppy waters at speeds that would make any modern-day speedboat jealous. But instead of shiny chrome, the Vikings had something way more impressive: oak. This was no ordinary wood either. It was tough, sturdy, and flexible enough to bend with the waves, but strong enough to resist cracking. Imagine the craftsmanship that went into each longship. It was built with overlapping planks, or clinker-built, which gave it the ability to flex with the sea rather than breaking under pressure. This design meant that the ship could handle wild, unpredictable waves and still keep going. It's like if someone decided to build a kayak, but with the intent to survive a thunderstorm. The construction wasn't just for show. It was survival in its purest form. It was a marriage of function and form, blending artistry with engineering, something the Vikings did remarkably well. They didn't just know how to wield an axe, they knew how to wield the very wood they chopped down to make these ships. Now, let's talk about the hull, which had to be so light that it could glide across the sea at speeds that would make the modern-day ferry feel like it was stuck in traffic. The hull was built up of a series of lightweight but strong timber frames, and the Vikings would fill the gaps with wooden ribs and iron nails. Every inch of this ship had a purpose. They didn't have luxury cruise ships with air conditioning and cocktail bars. The Vikings didn't even have the luxury of a ship bathroom. If you needed to go, you probably did it off the side of the boat. But let's not focus on the uncomfortable bits just yet, because if you've ever had to navigate stormy seas, or cross a body of water the size of an ocean, you would kill for a ship that was as well designed as a Viking longship. These ships could carry a crew of 30 or more, which means the Vikings were probably having all kinds of great adventures or arguments during those long, cold nights at sea. And remember, these ships didn't just go on quick day trips to the beach. Oh no, the Vikings used these marvels of engineering to travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic, from the cold waters of Scandinavia all the way to Newfoundland and beyond. Now let's get to the real heart of Viking exploration. How did they do it without the modern conveniences we take for granted today? There were no radar systems or satellite signals, and there certainly wasn't a cell phone app to tell them which direction to head in. But the Vikings had something far more valuable, an intimate understanding of the natural world around them. They used the sun, the stars, the wind, and even the behavior of birds to navigate their way across vast stretches of open water. Imagine sailing across the cold expanse of the North Sea at night, the wind howling through the rigging of your ship, and looking up at the stars. The Vikings didn't need a star map. They just had to know which constellation to look for. The North Star was their go-to guide for determining direction, and if that wasn't available, they used the position of the sun to figure out where they were going. And of course, they had to have a good sense of humor, because you can't always trust the weather in the North Sea. Speaking of weather, let's consider the chaos of the open water for a second. Viking sailors didn't have the luxury of modern weather reports telling them to avoid the area near the storm or don't set sail today. No, they had to rely on their own senses to determine when to leave port and when to hunker down. And trust me, when you're on a ship that looks like it could capsize in a strong breeze, the decision to head out into unpredictable weather takes more guts than a Black Friday sale at IKEA. But these Vikings, they were all about embracing the chaos. Windstorms, bring it. Waves crashing over the bow. That's just another day at sea. The sails themselves were nothing short of a triumph of Viking ingenuity. Made of wool, they were often dyed in bright reds or yellows, which, according to some, wasn't just for style points. They were probably meant to intimidate the competition. Imagine a group of Vikings pulling up on a beach in these bright, terrifyingly fast ships, looking like they're about to pillage your town and thinking, hey, maybe today isn't the best day to fight? The sail would be rigged to catch the wind, while a rudder at the stern kept the ship steered in the right direction. And when there wasn't enough wind, the Vikings didn't sit around complaining. They used oars, rowing the ship forward by sheer muscle power. When the Vikings set sail on their longships, they weren't just leaving behind a small village. They were embarking on legendary journeys that would take them to the ends of the earth. They crossed the Atlantic, found new lands, raided coasts, and traded across continents, all with nothing but a boat made from trees, a set of oars, and the stars above. Every longship was a testament to the Vikings' mastery of the seas and their unyielding desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. So, next time you find yourself complaining about the small inconvenience of a bumpy flight, take a moment to think about those Viking adventurers. They braved stormy seas, fought off raiders, and made epic voyages, all without the luxury of weather apps or comfy seats. If nothing else, they definitely earned their right to brag about their boat. Imagine being Leif Erikson, an overachieving son of a Viking king, setting sail for adventure. You end up in North America, thousands of miles from home, completely unaware of how badly you'd mess with future textbooks. Was Leif Erikson really the first European to reach North America? Or did he just get a little lost, like every GPS-challenged traveler, and accidentally discover the New World? Well, whatever the truth, we can all agree that Leif Erikson deserves at least a high five for stumbling into history. But let's dig a little deeper into this Norseman's wild ride, because the truth about Leif's voyage is as murky as a foggy fjord. First off, let's talk about who Leif Erikson was. Born around the year 970, Leif was the son of the famous Viking explorer Eric the Red, who had, in a truly Viking fashion, made his own name by, well, being exiled to Greenland. In typical Viking fashion, Leif was raised on a diet of adventure, sagas, and the occasional shipwreck. His father, Eric the Red, had settled in Greenland after being kicked out of Iceland for, surprise, surprise, killing someone. So naturally, young Leif was raised with a hearty appreciation for the wild, the unpredictable, and the slightly illegal. But here's the thing, Leif Erikson wasn't just some Viking who decided to head off on a whim. No. This was a man who came from a lineage of big thinkers. Leif was a dreamer, with the blood of explorers running through his veins. Now, let's get to the juicy part. Was Leif really the first European to set foot in North America, or was he just trying to find a cool place for a vacation and accidentally started an entire historical movement? Some say Leif Erikson set sail for North America with grand plans of finding new lands. After all, his father had done it. Why couldn't he? Leif's journey began when he sailed from Greenland with a crew, looking for a place called Vinland, an area described in the sagas as fertile and abundant with resources. You know, the kind of place that makes you want to pack up your whole life and go. They sailed westward across the open ocean, and after a journey full of seasickness, fighting off seagulls, and losing a few good Viking axes, they landed somewhere on the northeastern coast of North America, which we now know as Newfoundland. That's right, Leif Erikson, in his quest for adventure, may very well have been the first European to set foot in what would later become the United States and Canada. Pretty impressive, right? But before we start building statues of Leif, let's address the one thing that no Viking saga ever seems to mention: Leif's ability to get lost. While some historical accounts suggest that Leif set out intentionally to discover new lands, others point out that the poor guy was probably just trying to get home after a journey to Norway. You see, Viking navigation was no small feat. They didn't have maps that could be updated every few minutes with the latest road closures or detours. The Vikings had to rely on the stars, the sun, and a whole lot of guesswork. Leif might have just been navigating the wild sea like most of us try to navigate our way through life, hoping to stumble into the right place and maybe make a name for ourselves in the process. So, was Leif Erikson a brilliant explorer, or was he just a guy with a bad sense of direction? We may never know. What we do know is that he somehow managed to get to what he called Vinland, a place full of wild grapes and a land rich with potential. No one's sure exactly where Vinland was, but the general consensus is that it was somewhere along the northern coast of modern-day Canada, particularly around Newfoundland. This was no small feat for someone sailing a ship without a motor, a map, or any of the modern tools we rely on to keep us from getting hopelessly lost on road trips. Leif Erikson wasn't using Google Maps to zoom in on the nearest McDonald's. He was depending on his wits, the stars, and possibly a lot of hope. When Leif arrived, things were a little more complicated than he probably expected. There were already people living there. Yes, the indigenous peoples of North America. This wasn't the vacation spot discovered by Europeans' fantasy. Leif's crew didn't just show up, set up a beach chair, and start enjoying the wild grapes. No, instead they had to negotiate, trade, and probably try to avoid being attacked by people who didn't appreciate Viking visitors. Because let's be honest, how welcoming would you be if a bunch of uninvited travelers showed up on your shore with axes and a really bad accent? Despite these awkward interactions, Leif and his crew did manage to settle in briefly, building a settlement of sorts. But the real question is, why did Leif leave? Did he just get homesick? Did he forget to pack enough provisions? Or maybe, just maybe, was the land of Vinland not as wonderful as it sounded in the sagas? Maybe the wild grapes weren't as tasty as they'd been led to believe, and maybe the land was just a little too wild and cold for the Vikings' liking. Whatever the reason, Leif didn't stick around for long. Instead, he returned to Greenland, where he would later become a hero in Viking lore, having discovered a new world, even if it was a world that wasn't all that interested in him staying. But here's where things get even more interesting. If you ever wondered where the Viking age went after Leif's grand adventure, here's the kicker. It sort of disappeared. Leif and his crew may have made it to North America, but the Vikings didn't exactly set up an empire. They didn't leave behind castles or armies. Well, not that we've found anyway. Instead, they faded away. By the time Christopher Columbus came around, the Vikings were long gone, and their brief stint in North America was all but forgotten. Now, modern historians are split on whether Leif's journey should be considered the discovery of the New World. On one hand, he was likely the first European to reach North America, but on the other hand, his settlement was short-lived, and the Vikings didn't exactly stick around to develop the land. So, is Leif Erikson a hero, or was he just an accidental tourist getting lost in the wilderness and managing to leave behind a legacy by sheer happenstance? It's one of those historical mysteries that you can never quite settle. So as you lie down tonight, just remember, Leif Erikson didn't just stumble into history, he made history, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't trying to discover North America at all. He might have just been looking for a new place to settle, maybe a nice vineyard or a peaceful beach, and ended up changing the world forever in the process. A true Viking adventure, filled with unexpected twists, turns and wild, uncharted lands. After all, isn't that what the Vikings did best? Hold on tight, because we're about to challenge everything you thought you knew about Viking exploration. Did they really make it all the way to the Americas, or is that just a really big, beard-tastic myth? Tonight, let's separate fact from fable and talk about the fierce seafarers who left their mark on the world. You won't believe what they left behind, but before we dive in, let's set the stage for what we're about to uncover. You're probably imagining a bunch of horned helmet-wearing Vikings storming the shores of North America, hoisting axes and looting villages, right? Well, while there was certainly some of that, the truth of the Viking invasion is a little more nuanced and a lot more intriguing. First, let's take a moment to think about how the Vikings even made it across the Atlantic in the first place. These guys didn't have massive modern ships or fancy navigation systems. Instead, they relied on longships, sleek wooden boats that could glide through both shallow waters and stormy seas. With no compass, no GPS, and nothing but their wits and a solid understanding of the stars, the Vikings somehow managed to sail from Scandinavia all the way to Greenland, and as it turns out, North America. How did they do it? Well, they used everything from the sun to the stars to navigate. They had a remarkable understanding of the natural world, so much so that their journeys across the ocean were far more precise than we give them credit for. Imagine sailing through unpredictable weather with nothing but the stars and a few birds to guide you. If that doesn't sound like a recipe for disaster, I don't know what does. Yet these Vikings weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Now let's talk about the actual invasion of North America. Most people assume that Columbus was the first European to set foot in the Americas. But did you know the Vikings were probably here almost 500 years before him? Leif Erikson, that overachieving son of Eric the Red, made it to the shores of North America around the year 1000, long before Columbus set sail. According to the sagas, Leif landed in what they called Vineland, a place described as rich with resources, where the soil was fertile and the wild grapes grew. And while no one can pinpoint exactly where Vinland was, many historians believe it was located somewhere in what we now call Newfoundland, in Canada. So, was it an invasion? Well, let's not get carried away. Leif and his crew didn't exactly show up with an army ready to take over. Instead, they set up camp, traded with the indigenous people, and probably got a little too excited about the abundance of resources. But here's the kicker. This wasn't a one-time thing. The Vikings didn't just drop by for a casual summer vacation. They stayed for a while, possibly even tried to settle, but ultimately left. Why? Well, that's where the story gets a little more complicated. The Vikings' interactions with the indigenous peoples of North America weren't all friendly. According to some sagas, the Norsemen clashed with the native tribes over resources, and things didn't exactly go smoothly. It seems the Vikings weren't exactly prepared to deal with the local population. In fact, they may have underestimated the resistance they'd face. Picture it. You've just sailed across the stormy Atlantic, only to discover that the land you thought was a peaceful paradise is actually inhabited by fierce, resourceful people who aren't too thrilled to have you drop in uninvited. So much for peaceful trading. But the Viking invasion wasn't about conquest. It wasn't like the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs or the English in the New World. No, the Vikings were far more interested in exploring, raiding, and trading rather than setting up a permanent colony. They weren't looking to settle in what they had hoped would be a new world. They were looking to see if it was worth coming back for. But here's the twist. While the Vikings may not have been the aggressive colonizers that later European explorers became, they did leave something behind. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of Viking settlements, like the one at Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland, confirming that the Vikings made it to North America, hundreds of years before Columbus even thought about sailing across the Atlantic. They didn't just leave behind a couple of rumors and myths. They left traces of their existence. Timber remains, iron nails, tools, and even remnants of their dwellings have been found at this site. This wasn't just a casual pit stop. It was a functioning settlement, albeit a small one, that had been built to withstand the elements of a harsh northern climate. Imagine trying to make it through the brutal winters of Newfoundland without all the modern comforts we enjoy. No central heating, no Amazon Prime, no hot showers, just solid wood and a bunch of men who weren't afraid of a little hard work. The discovery of Lanzo Meadows has been a game changer, showing us that the Vikings didn't just pass through. They stayed and tried to make a go of it. And while they eventually abandoned the site, their presence was undeniable. Now let's get back to the whole idea of an invasion. Did the Vikings actually conquer North America? Or was it more of a, we'll check it out and maybe come back kind of situation? The truth seems to lie somewhere in between. The Vikings didn't just waltz into North America, take over, and establish a new empire. No, they were more like the world's most ambitious tourists. Except, instead of taking selfies in front of landmarks, they were building homes, trading with locals, and trying to figure out if this new land was worth settling. They certainly made an impression, even if it was just a fleeting one. But the fact that they made it to North America, and that we're still talking about it today, speaks volumes about their resilience, their seafaring skills, and their ability to adapt to unknown lands. And while the Vikings didn't exactly leave behind a lasting empire in the Americas, their story did leave a profound impact on history. They helped rewrite what we know about early exploration, proving that the Europeans weren't the first ones to set foot on this continent. It wasn't just Columbus and the Spanish, it was also the Vikings, who made their way across the Atlantic in search of new lands and new opportunities. The Viking invasion of North America may not have been a traditional conquest, but it was still an exploration that changed the way we view the history of the New World. So as you lie down tonight, think about those Vikings, not the ones in the movies, but the real ones, with their longships, their courage, and their ability to navigate uncharted waters. Their journey wasn't about conquest, it was about discovery. And sometimes, the greatest discoveries come not from making a mark on the land, but from the traces we leave behind, whether that's a settlement, a legend, or just a bunch of really cool historical artifacts. Now, imagine arriving at Meadows, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, where the quiet winds and calm waters are the only things telling the story of a lost Viking settlement. When archaeologists uncovered this place, they didn't just find some forgotten stone circles. They found a whole new chapter of North American history, a chapter with Viking helmets, fur-lined coats, and one heck of a mystery. You're standing on the very land where Viking explorers more than 1,000 years ago, once carved out a tiny, fleeting existence in a place no one had expected. So, how exactly did this discovery come about? And what's the real story behind this remote settlement? Let's rewind a bit to the 1960s, when a curious Norwegian archaeologist, Helge Ingstad, and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad embarked on an adventure that would ultimately change the way we view early exploration. They weren't setting out to uncover a Viking settlement, but rather they were searching for clues about the legendary Vinland, a place described in ancient Viking sagas as rich in resources, where wild grapes grew and the soil was fertile enough to sustain a small settlement. And what do you know? They found it. But this wasn't some place filled with towering stone castles or elaborate Viking banquets. No, what they unearthed at Meadows was humble, almost serene, yet it was undeniably Viking. This wasn't the pillaging, axe-wielding, plundering Viking stereotype. This was a side of the Norse world few ever expected to see, the quiet settlers. Picture this. You're walking through the lush green grass of Newfoundland, the cool ocean breeze brushing against your face, and suddenly your eyes fall on something unusual. At first it's easy to dismiss, just a few rocks scattered about. But then, as you get closer, you see it. The remains of a Viking longhouse, a collapsed timber frame that looks like it could have been standing just yesterday. That's when you realize the significance of what's lying underfoot. This was no ordinary excavation. What the Ingstads uncovered was proof that the Vikings had not only reached North America, but they had lived here for a while, leaving behind the remnants of their time in what would become one of the most important historical sites in the world. Meadows wasn't a massive Viking city. In fact, it was quite small, consisting of a handful of structures that could have housed a small group of settlers, probably a dozen or so. Yet even in its humble state, this settlement was remarkable. The Ingstads found remains of turf huts, the kind that Vikings used to protect themselves from the harsh, cold winds of the north. These weren't just temporary shelters made of basic materials. No, these structures were built to last. They were carefully constructed, with overlapping timbers, much like the clinker-built longships that had brought the Vikings across the ocean. These were homes meant to endure, a physical testament to the hard work and survival instincts of the men and women who lived there. What makes Meadows so significant is that it confirms what had long been thought to be a myth. For centuries, historians and archaeologists had debated the authenticity of the Viking sagas, the stories that spoke of Norse explorers sailing across the Atlantic and settling in distant lands. Many dismissed these tales as mere legend, exaggerations created to glorify the Viking world. But here, at Meadows, the evidence was undeniable. These weren't just stories, this was history. The discovery of this settlement wasn't just about finding Viking ruins, it was about finding a tangible connection to the past, a link between the sagas and the actual world the Vikings inhabited. It was like finding a time capsule from over 1,000 years ago, left by people who had been almost forgotten by history. Among the artifacts found at the site were Viking tools like iron nails, whetstones, and chisels. But it wasn't just the tools that told the story of the Vikings at Meadows. The clothing remnants also provided a fascinating glimpse into the lives of these ancient settlers. Fragments of fur-lined coats and boots were discovered, showing that the Vikings who lived here were clearly prepared for the harsh Newfoundland winters. These weren't the fur-covered Vikings you see in movies. These were practical, resourceful people who knew exactly how to survive in an unforgiving environment. But what's even more interesting is the fact that some of the artifacts, like the iron nails, were of a type that couldn't have been made locally. These were clearly Viking goods, further evidence that this wasn't just a random settlement. It was part of a larger Norse exploration, a piece of a much bigger story. But what was the true purpose of the settlement? Why did the Vikings, who were so skilled at raiding and exploring, decide to settle in this cold, remote part of the world? Was Lonso Meadows just a temporary stop on their way to other lands, or was it a serious attempt at establishing a permanent colony? While the settlement didn't last long, it's likely that the Vikings were looking for a new place to expand their influence and resources. They had already established a foothold in Greenland, and Newfoundland, with its fertile land and abundant resources, may have seemed like an ideal next step. But they didn't just settle without a plan. They had a vision for how they could make this new world work for them. However, as with many things Viking, life at Lonso Meadows probably wasn't easy. They had to contend with the harsh winters, unfamiliar terrain, and likely the indigenous peoples of the area. These early encounters were probably a mix of trade and conflict, though the exact nature of these interactions is still debated by historians. What's most remarkable about Lonso Meadows isn't just the physical remnants of Viking life. It's the story it tells about the Vikings themselves. These weren't just raiders and warriors. They were explorers, farmers, and settlers. The Vikings didn't just take from the world. They tried to build something, even in the harshest conditions. They were survivors, capable of thriving in some of the most unforgiving climates on the planet. Lonso Meadows, with its quiet beauty and understated significance, is a reminder that history is often more complicated than we imagine. It wasn't just the Spanish or the English who laid claim to the New World. Long before Columbus, the Vikings were already here, leaving behind traces of their presence in what was, at the time, a foreign land. Their time at Lonso Meadows may have been short, but the impact of that discovery will resonate for centuries to come. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that sometimes the quietest places, like Lonso Meadows, hold the biggest secrets. As you dig deeper into the history of Lonso Meadows, imagine the sound of a shovel scraping through ancient soil, revealing the remains of Viking tools. This isn't your average backyard archaeology project. These artifacts are straight out of Viking lore, from iron nails to whetstones, showing a community that didn't just stumble across the ocean but truly built something. With each piece uncovered, the reality of Viking life at Lonso Meadows becomes clearer, a testament to their tenacity, craftsmanship, and resilience. These were not just wild adventurers, they were settlers, innovators, and, as it turns out, master builders. And the things they left behind speak volumes about who they were, what they endured, and how they lived. The story of the artifacts found at Lonso Meadows begins with the discovery itself. When archaeologists unearthed the site in the 1960s, they were expecting to find something, perhaps remnants of a forgotten settlement or traces of ancient human life. What they didn't expect to find was a well-preserved slice of Viking history, one that would add a whole new layer to our understanding of pre-Columbian contact with North America. The excavation revealed not just random scraps or bits of useless debris, but actual Viking tools, weapons, and personal belongings that painted a picture of a thriving, functional settlement. One of the most significant finds at the site were iron nails. To the casual observer, nails might seem like an everyday object, nothing special. But for the Vikings, nails were a sign of something far more important: civilization. Iron nails were essential for building their iconic longhouses and ships. And these weren't just any nails. They were of a type that could only be made using Viking technology, unmistakable in their design and craftsmanship. These nails weren't left behind as a fluke. They were deliberately forged by skilled blacksmiths, evidence that the Vikings had come prepared to establish a presence in North America. This wasn't a place they simply discovered by accident. No, the people who arrived at Lonso Meadows were ready to settle and build. The very presence of these nails shows that the Vikings saw this new land not just as an adventure, but as a potential home. But nails weren't the only things they left behind. As archaeologists continued to dig, they uncovered other vital artifacts, such as whetstones. Now, if you've ever sharpened a knife or tool, you know that a good whetstone can make all the difference. For the Vikings, these tools weren't just for show, they were necessary for survival. Whetstones helped them maintain the sharpness of their weapons, ensuring they were always ready for whatever came their way, whether that meant hunting for food, building shelters, or defending themselves. At Lonso Meadows, these whetstones painted a picture of a self-sufficient community, one that didn't just rely on raiding and exploration, but also on craftsmanship and practical skills. In fact, these whetstones were so finely crafted that they suggest the Vikings who lived there weren't just using basic makeshift tools. They were highly skilled artisans who knew exactly what they were doing. And then there are the other personal items found at the site, which really drive home the idea that these Vikings weren't just transient wanderers. Among the discoveries were remnants of clothing, including bits of fur-lined coats and leather boots. It's easy to forget that the Vikings were just as concerned with comfort as they were with survival. The fur-lined coats and boots found at Lanceau Meadows show that the settlers didn't just survive the harsh Newfoundland winters. They did it in style. These garments weren't hastily thrown together. They were carefully made, likely by the same people who crafted the ships that brought them across the ocean. The Vikings were a people who valued both practicality and appearance, and these clothing remnants reflect a deep understanding of their environment and needs. They weren't just surviving, they were adapting, using local materials to ensure they could withstand the elements in this new, rugged land. However, the tools, nails, and clothing aren't the only fascinating artifacts found at Lanceau Meadows. The site also revealed remnants of Viking-era pottery and a range of other everyday objects. Pottery was a critical part of daily life for the Vikings, used for cooking, storage, and even as trade items. At Lanceau Meadows, archaeologists found several pieces of pottery that were unmistakably Viking in origin, providing further evidence that the settlers here were indeed part of the larger Viking world. Pottery isn't just about practicality, it also shows a community's level of cultural development. The fact that the Vikings took the time to create pottery suggests they weren't just interested in survival, they were interested in building a functional, organized society, even in the wilderness of North America. Perhaps the most surprising artifact to be found, however, were a series of spindle whorls. These small disc-shaped objects were used in the process of spinning yarn or thread. In the Viking world, spinning was not just a domestic chore, it was an essential part of life, from creating the clothing they wore to the sails on their longships. Finding spindle whorls at Lanceau Meadows revealed something fascinating. The Vikings weren't just living off the land, they were also creating things. They were spinning their own yarn, making their own cloth, and producing goods for trade. It wasn't just about raiding or conquering. The Vikings had an intricate, self-sustaining economy, and the discovery of these artifacts highlights their skills in craftsmanship, trade, and resourcefulness. But what does all this tell us about the Vikings who lived at Lanceau Meadows? They were, first and foremost, survivors. The tools, nails, clothing, and pottery left behind at the site all tell a story of a community that didn't just land on a beach and leave a few footprints. They landed and stayed. They built structures, made tools, and created goods. This was a community that knew how to live in an unfamiliar land, far from home. And while their settlement at Lanceau Meadows may have been short-lived, the artifacts they left behind tell us that they were here not by accident, but by design. In the end, the Viking artifacts found at Lanceau Meadows paint a picture of a people who were much more than the bloodthirsty raiders of popular legend. These artifacts remind us that the Vikings were explorers, settlers, craftsmen, and survivors. They didn't just sail across the ocean, they built lives, created communities, and left a mark on history that we're still uncovering today. So, the next time you pick up a whetstone or nail, just remember, these were the same tools that helped the Vikings carve out a piece of history in a place where no one thought they'd ever be. The Vikings didn't just leave behind a legacy of raids and battles, they left behind a legacy of resilience, creativity, and the spirit of adventure that defined their remarkable civilization. How is it that Vikings managed to establish a settlement in Newfoundland without anyone noticing for centuries? Was this the ultimate "oops, we were here first" moment in history? As we explore, let's marvel at how the Vikings somehow managed to set up shop in North America without any of the usual modern conveniences or, let's be real, proper tourist infrastructure. You'd think there would be at least a sign or a brochure, something. Instead, the Vikings just quietly slipped into history's blind spot, leaving behind only fragments of evidence to tell their story. Let's begin with the grand question. Why, of all places, would the Vikings choose to set up a settlement in the icy, unforgiving land of Newfoundland? Was it an accident, or did they really see something others missed? The settlement at Lanceau Meadows, the most well-known Viking site in North America, wasn't just a temporary pit stop for a few weary sailors. This was a community, complete with longhouses, tools, and remnants of Viking craftsmanship, built in a place most people at the time probably couldn't have found on a map, if maps existed at all. Now, imagine being one of those Viking explorers. You've just crossed the vast expanse of the North Atlantic in a longship, hoping to find something more than just endless ocean. After months of sailing in treacherous waters, navigating by the stars and the sun, or maybe just sheer willpower, you finally spot land. But this land isn't Greenland, Iceland, or the familiar shores of Scandinavia. This is something different, something wild, something remote. Welcome to Newfoundland. This land, with its untamed forests and rugged coastline, wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect a group of seafaring adventurers to land. You'd think the Vikings might have made a beeline for something a little more hospitable, maybe a tropical island, or at least somewhere with more than just ice, trees, and an occasional moose. But the Vikings weren't ones to shy away from a challenge, especially when it came to finding new territories to settle, raid, or trade with. Newfoundland, with its rich resources and proximity to other lands, seemed like a promising location. But how did they manage to get there without anyone noticing for centuries? That's where the mystery lies. Despite their advanced seafaring skills, the Vikings didn't exactly leave behind a trail of billboards marking their arrival. In fact, they left so little behind that it took over 1,000 years for modern archaeologists to uncover their presence. So what happened in that gap between the Vikings' arrival and the eventual rediscovery of Lanceau Meadows in the 1960s? Well, the Vikings were never known for their subtlety, and it seems they didn't exactly make an effort to announce their settlement to the world. This wasn't like the English colonization of America, where there were large-scale invasions, the establishment of permanent cities, and the creation of immediate historical records. No, the Viking settlement at Lanceau Meadows was, in a way, more like an unmarked rest stop on the highway of history. They built some houses, sharpened their weapons, and did a little trading with the indigenous peoples. But then, just as quietly as they arrived, they left. It's almost like the world's first pop-up settlement, gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a few clues behind. But how could such an important historical site be overlooked for so long? The answer might lie in the sheer remoteness of the location. Newfoundland, in the 11th century, was hardly a place bustling with tourists, or even a good place to stumble upon by accident. The landscape was wild, unpredictable, and harsh. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of social media or even written maps to guide them in their explorations. They had oral traditions and sagas passed down through the generations. Those sagas spoke of distant lands, including Vinland, but the exact location was, and remains, a matter of debate. While Lanceau Meadows is now the most likely candidate, there are still some mysteries surrounding the Vikings' navigation. The Vikings were master sailors, yes, but they didn't exactly advertise their settlements with flags and landmarks. Instead, they quietly established themselves, possibly in multiple locations across the North American coast, leaving subtle traces of their presence without leaving an obvious footprint on the historical landscape. When the settlement was eventually uncovered in the 1960s, the site revealed not just the remnants of Viking life, but a remarkable story of survival and adaptation. Here were the remains of longhouses built with the same craftsmanship that went into their ships, strong, functional, and perfectly suited for the environment. The Vikings didn't just land and leave. They made an effort to create something lasting, though they may not have anticipated that their legacy would lie dormant for so long. Perhaps they thought this would be just one of many successful settlements, a first step toward a Viking empire in North America. But whatever their intentions were, the reality is that they never got the chance to follow through. Their reasons for leaving are still up for debate. Some historians suggest that the Vikings were chased out by indigenous peoples, who may not have welcomed their uninvited guests. Others speculate that the environment itself was too harsh to maintain a settlement, with long, cold winters and limited resources. The Vikings might have looked at their potential in Newfoundland and decided it wasn't worth sticking around. They had already established strongholds in Greenland and Iceland, and perhaps they figured North America could wait until later. Whatever the reason, the Viking settlement in Newfoundland didn't last long, and it was quickly forgotten, overshadowed by later European explorations and colonizations. It wasn't until the 1960s when archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, uncovered the site at Lanceau Meadows that the world truly realized what had been hidden all this time. The discovery revealed a small but significant Viking presence in North America, proof that the Vikings had made it to the continent long before Columbus and the other explorers of the 15th century. It was as if the Vikings had dropped an envelope into history's mailbox, addressed to future generations, and simply walked away before anyone had a chance to open it. So what happened to the Vikings in Newfoundland? Did they just pack up and head home? Did they decide that the land wasn't worth the trouble? We may never know for sure, but one thing is certain. The Vikings left behind a legacy in Newfoundland, a quiet, understated but profound one. Their settlement may have been small, their stay brief, but their mark on history is undeniable. And while the world may have forgotten their time in North America for centuries, the Vikings were here doing what they did best, exploring, surviving, and quietly changing the course of history, one unmarked settlement at a time. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine that quiet, windswept shore of Newfoundland. Imagine the Vikings standing there, surveying the land, perhaps realizing they had discovered something truly remarkable. If only They knew how long it would take for the rest of the world to notice. Let's talk about a crazy theory. What if the Vikings were never meant to settle in North America at all? Maybe they were just really, really lost. After all, they didn't exactly have Google Maps, just the stars and their compasses. And what happens when a group of unprepared Norsemen sail across an ocean, think they've found a paradise, and end up running into the indigenous peoples? This is the kind of theory that makes history a little more absurd and a lot more fun to consider. What if the Vikings didn't come to North America with grand ambitions to colonize and settle? What if they just stumbled into the wrong place, convinced they had found their version of paradise, only to realize too late that they were about to make history by accident? Now, before you roll your eyes and say, sure, the Vikings just accidentally discovered a continent, let's consider it for a moment. The Vikings were master navigators, but they didn't have the kind of navigational tools we have today. They didn't have satellite images or even good old-fashioned maps with landmarks clearly marked. They had the stars, the sun, and the sea, and even that wasn't always enough to keep them from getting lost. This wasn't a simple journey like driving to your local grocery store. This was a risky, months-long voyage across the vast, unpredictable Atlantic Ocean, where the idea of destination was probably more of a vague concept than a clearly defined goal. Imagine being a Viking explorer, setting out from Greenland or Iceland with your trusty crew of rowdy Norsemen, and thinking to yourself, you know what? I think there's land over that way. You don't know for sure, of course, but it looks like a good direction to try, so why not? With no map, no GPS, and just a vague idea from ancient sagas, you sail off, fully expecting to reach a land as familiar as home. After days of sailing through choppy waves and unpredictable winds, you finally catch sight of land. It's not Greenland, it's not Iceland, it's something new, something very different. You step off the ship, take in the unfamiliar surroundings, and you think to yourself, this is it. This is Vinland, the fertile land of your dreams, described in sagas filled with wild grapes and friendly locals. But what if that's not what you find? What if instead you find something far more complicated, and the people who are already there don't quite see you as a long-lost traveler, but as an invader? This brings us to the indigenous peoples of North America. We often imagine the arrival of the Vikings as a grand historical moment, full of epic battles and intense negotiations. But what if it wasn't that dramatic? What if it was more of a baffling, awkward encounter between two groups of people who had no idea what to make of each other? The Vikings, having traveled across an ocean, thought they had stumbled upon paradise. But to the indigenous peoples of North America, this was just another day. A bunch of strange-looking men with long beards and big axes showing up on their shores probably wasn't part of the plan either. What happened next? Did the Vikings try to set up shop, plant their flag, and make themselves at home? Or did they quickly realize that maybe, just maybe, this paradise wasn't quite what they thought it was? The sagas tell us that the Vikings attempted to establish settlements, like at Lonso Meadows, but we also know from the archaeological evidence that their stay was short-lived. Some historians argue that the indigenous peoples of the area weren't exactly thrilled by these new arrivals. In fact, the Norsemen may have quickly found themselves caught up in a strange dance of trade, cultural misunderstanding, and perhaps even conflict. And remember, this wasn't some new world waiting to be conquered by some mythical band of heroes. This was a land already inhabited by peoples who had been living, thriving, and building their own civilizations for thousands of years. The idea of simply waltzing in, setting up shop, and expecting everything to go according to plan, well, that wasn't going to happen. But let's take a step back and consider the possibility that the Vikings weren't planning to settle here at all. What if they were simply exploring, as they were known to do, trying to find new lands or valuable resources that could enhance their power back in Greenland and Iceland? Their primary interest might not have been conquest or settlement, but just to chart the world, explore the unknown, and find things to bring back home. After all, the Vikings were explorers at heart, not necessarily colonizers. They were much more interested in trade, raiding, and gathering resources than setting up permanent colonies. Their ships were designed for exploration, not for creating city-states. If they encountered resistance, or if they simply ran out of supplies, it wouldn't have been long before they packed up and moved on. It's not hard to imagine how this could have happened. After all, the Vikings didn't exactly have the comforts of modern life. They didn't have maps of the New World, reliable weather predictions, or the knowledge that the land they'd stumbled upon would eventually become a historical landmark. What they did have was courage and an unrelenting desire to explore new horizons. They didn't always know where they were going, but that never stopped them. They were sailing blind, figuring things out as they went, and hoping they didn't end up running aground somewhere, or worse, off the edge of the world. What if the Vikings thought they were just passing through, stopping to trade and maybe test the waters for future explorations? It's not out of the question that they didn't intend to stay long, even though they did establish a settlement. Maybe they thought their new discovery was just a brief detour, a pit stop, before heading back home to their known world. So what do we make of all this? Were the Vikings truly the first Europeans to set foot in North America, or were they just really lost? The evidence suggests that they were indeed the first Europeans, but the real question is, why did they leave? Did they abandon the settlement because it wasn't what they expected? Were they simply too far from home to make it work? Or did they just lose interest once the resources weren't as abundant as they'd hoped? Whatever the truth, it's clear that the Vikings didn't set out to conquer a new world, but to explore one. They didn't arrive with the ambition of colonizers, but with the curiosity of wanderers. Their journey to North America may not have been planned, but it certainly left a lasting legacy. As you settle in for the night, think about the Vikings, those bold adventurers who took risks without knowing exactly where they were going, and in the process opened up a chapter of history that would be rediscovered centuries later, long after their journey had ended. As the wind howls through the trees, picture the Norsemen gathered around their campfires, not just feasting, but telling epic tales of their journeys. These stories were passed down for generations, immortalizing their adventures, conquests, and maybe even a few tall tales. But how accurate were these stories? Was the real Viking saga anything like the legends we've come to know? These stories weren't just for entertainment. No, they were the lifeblood of Viking culture, woven into the fabric of every raid, every battle, and every journey. They were passed down by skalds, the Viking poets who shaped the very idea of heroism, adventure, and legacy. Tonight, let's step into that world, where every song and story could turn a mortal man into a living legend, and maybe a few over-embellishments could sneak in along the way. Imagine the scene, a crackling fire in the center, surrounded by rowdy Vikings, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The smell of roasting meat mixes with the scent of pine wood, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees carries a distant, eerie note. But it's not the cold night air or the crackling fire that commands the attention. It's the voice of a skald, the Viking poet, weaving tales of far-off lands, terrifying monsters, and heroic deeds. The skald's words flow like the waves of the ocean, rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. Each stanza is carefully crafted, each word deliberate. The skald's job wasn't just to entertain, it was to preserve the past and shape the future. The sagas were more than just stories, they were a way to immortalize the Viking way of life. But let's talk about how these stories were passed down. Viking culture was a deeply oral one, meaning that there were no books or written records to rely on, at least not in the way we think of them today. The skalds were the historians, the chroniclers, and the entertainers all rolled into one. These poets would travel with the Viking armies, keeping their words sharp and their memories sharper. It was their job to remember and recount the glorious deeds of kings, warriors, and explorers. And as with any story passed down through the generations, the retelling often came with a little creative license. So, how reliable were these tales? Were Viking sagas fact or fiction? Well, here's where things get tricky. The sagas, like the famous saga of the Volsungs or the saga of Eric the Red, were written down centuries after the events they described. By the time they were finally penned, the Viking world had already undergone drastic changes, and many of the original storytellers had long passed on. So what we know about the Vikings is a blend of truth, myth, and let's be honest, a lot of embellishment. The stories we read today, whether it's about Thor's hammer or Ragnar Lothbrok's dramatic life, have been filtered through layers of storytelling, each generation adding their own twist to the tale. Think about it. The Vikings were a people who valued strength, courage, and honor. But they also lived in a world of constant danger, battles, raids, and uncertain survival. It's no surprise that the tales told around the fire often turned ordinary events into grand epics. A simple skirmish could become a battle between gods. A stormy sea voyage could become a quest for immortality. This wasn't just because the Vikings loved a good story. It was because they lived in a harsh world, and they needed heroes. Heroes to inspire them in times of battle. Heroes to remind them that despite the cold winds and relentless storms, there was glory to be found in every conquest. Take the story of Eric the Red, for example. In his saga, we learn that he was exiled from Iceland and set out to discover Greenland, a land so far removed from civilization that no one believed it existed. But Eric didn't just sail off into the unknown. According to the sagas, he made the journey to Greenland not as a lonely outcast, but as a man driven by destiny, a man whose journey would become the stuff of legend. Is it true? Who knows? But that's the beauty of the saga. The narrative makes the impossible seem possible, and the everyday becomes extraordinary. And let's not forget the gods themselves, Thor, Odin, and Loki, whose tales were woven into the sagas, elevating the very nature of Viking existence. These gods didn't just sit on mountaintops with their thunderbolts. They were as wild and unpredictable as the Vikings themselves. The stories of their triumphs and failures helped shape Viking identity, giving them a sense of divine purpose that blended seamlessly with the harshness of their earthly lives. The skalds didn't just recount battles, they linked their warriors' exploits to the actions of gods, making their feats feel cosmic in scale. But the Vikings' love for these dramatic tales wasn't just about the grandeur of it all. There was a certain pragmatism to their myth-making. The sagas weren't just entertaining, they were instructional. The heroes in the sagas often faced impossible odds, but they triumphed through bravery, cunning, and an unyielding spirit. For a Viking warrior, listening to these tales was like receiving a manual on how to live a life worth remembering. And for the generations that followed, these stories were not just bedtime entertainment. They were lessons in leadership, loyalty, and the harsh realities of the world. Now, as we sift through these tales, we have to ask, how much of it is myth? And how much is history? It's tough to separate the two. Some of the more famous Viking heroes, like Ragnar Lothbrok, may have never even existed, yet his story has endured for centuries, thanks to the skalds who immortalized him in song. Was Ragnar real, or was he simply the perfect embodiment of the Viking ideal? Perhaps a bit of both. What the skalds did was take the essence of Viking society, their love for adventure, their fearlessness, and their belief in fate, and turn it into something that could outlast the individual. Through their art, they ensured that even the most ordinary Viking would be remembered long after his death. The role of the skald wasn't without its challenges, though. Imagine having to keep up with a society that was constantly on the move, raiding, exploring, and facing constant danger. The skalds had to be quick on their feet, adjusting their stories to reflect the changing tides of Viking life. They had to balance history with myth, fact with fiction, and most importantly, they had to keep their audience entertained. After all, these stories were told around the fire, passed from one Viking to another, and it was up to the skald to ensure the next generation of warriors would want to sit and listen. So, as you lay your head down tonight, think about the skalds, those wandering poets of the Viking world, who turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. These storytellers didn't just preserve history, they created it. Through their words, they ensured that the Vikings' legacy would live on, not just in the skulls of the warriors they defeated, but in the tales they told. And while some of the details might have been exaggerated, okay, probably a lot of them, the essence of what they immortalized is undeniable. In the world of the Vikings, everything could be made grand, every action heroic, and every journey the stuff of legend. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story we could all use once in a while. Did the Vikings leave behind any written records of their epic journey across the Atlantic? Sadly, no. Instead, we rely on sagas written centuries after the fact, which were part history and part myth. Let's uncover the mystery of why, despite their adventures, there's a massive gap in the Viking written record. Were they just too busy raiding and trading to write anything down? Or is there something more intriguing happening beneath the surface of Viking history that we've yet to fully understand? When you think about the Vikings, you probably picture their long ships slicing through the seas, their fierce warriors brandishing axes, and their fearless leaders charging into battle. And while we have plenty of vivid imagery about Viking life, one thing that's surprisingly absent from the picture is actual written documentation. While the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians left behind libraries of texts that tell us about their world, the Vikings seem to have skipped the whole writing stuff down thing. Instead, they left behind something much more elusive: stories. You might think that the Vikings, being so connected to the world through exploration, trade, and conquest, would have been keen on recording their own adventures. After all, their society was complex, with laws, customs, and an impressive fleet of ships designed to navigate oceans and rivers. But when it came to documentation, the Vikings did things a little differently. Instead of written records, they relied heavily on oral tradition to preserve their history. The epic sagas, tales of gods, heroes, and Viking kings were passed down from generation to generation, recited around campfires, in halls, or wherever a group of Vikings could sit and listen to their past come alive through words. Now you might wonder, why didn't they just write things down? The answer isn't entirely clear, but we do know that the Vikings had a form of written language. They used runes, those mysterious angular characters carved into stones, wood, and metal. These runes were often used for inscriptions, marking property and occasionally recording important events. But the runes weren't a full-fledged writing system meant for keeping detailed records or chronicling the vast adventures the Vikings were undertaking across the seas. Instead, they were more symbolic, a shorthand of sorts. And as much as we would like to imagine that every Viking ship's captain had a leather-bound journal filled with thoughts about navigating the North Atlantic, the reality is that the Vikings seemed more interested in living their epic lives than documenting them in writing. But still, there's something undeniably curious about the missing manuscripts. Why, when they were living through such monumental moments, didn't the Vikings put pen to parchment? Some historians have suggested that perhaps the Vikings were too busy with their daily survival and pursuits to bother with writing things down. After all, this was a people who spent much of their time raiding, trading, and exploring. Sitting down to write out their daily exploits might have seemed less important than sharpening their swords or making sure their ships were seaworthy. Another theory is that Vikings simply didn't see the point of writing things down. Viking culture was primarily oral, meaning their history, law, and traditions were transmitted through speech and memory. The skalds, the poets who accompanied Viking expeditions, were the official historians. They would memorize long, elaborate tales of battles, conquests, and the exploits of great warriors. These stories were meant to be recited, not read. Perhaps the Vikings didn't need written records in the same way we do today. Their entire society functioned on oral traditions, and their written language, runes, was likely more for symbolic or ritualistic purposes than for daily documentation. But here's the thing, while the Vikings didn't leave behind their own written accounts of their journeys, they were far from illiterate. In fact, the Vikings had a sophisticated oral tradition that was surprisingly effective in preserving their history. Their sagas, which were written down long after the events they describe, are full of rich details that offer insights into Viking culture, beliefs, and worldviews. These sagas are still the closest thing we have to Viking manuscripts, and they are fascinating in their own right, even if they are a mix of history and myth. The sagas were first transcribed in Iceland, about 200 years after the events they describe. They were written in Old Norse, a language that evolved from the Proto-Norse spoken by the Vikings. These texts aren't just historical records, they're also deeply embedded with the Vikings' mythology and their understanding of the world. You can't talk about the sagas without touching on the fact that they are, in many ways, a blend of reality and fiction. In a way, the sagas were designed to inspire as much as they were meant to inform. They recount legendary voyages, like the journey to Vinland, where Leif Erikson and his crew are said to have landed in what we now call North America, and the saga of the Volsungs, which mixes mythological elements with human drama. Even though the sagas were written down long after the events they describe, they offer a wealth of knowledge about Viking life. The stories may be a little embellished, because let's face it, every hero needs a bit of dramatic flair, but they still reflect the values, challenges, and cultural identity of the Viking world. They tell us about their gods and their heroes, their raids and their voyages, and perhaps most importantly, their belief in fate. The Vikings believed that fate was determined by the gods, but it was up to individuals to carve out their own destinies. It's this blend of divine will and human agency that makes the sagas so captivating. But let's circle back to the real mystery here. Why didn't the Vikings leave behind more written records? Could it be that they were too focused on the immediate needs of survival and conquest to think about future generations? Perhaps they didn't envision a future where historians and archaeologists would be sitting around asking why the Vikings didn't write more about their experiences. Perhaps they thought their stories would live on forever through their songs and oral traditions. And in some ways they were right, because despite the lack of written records, the Viking stories have indeed lived on, etched into the collective imagination of the world. So the next time you read a saga about a Viking warrior, a ship sailing into the unknown, or a god wielding thunder, remember that you're not just reading history, you're reading a story shaped by centuries of oral tradition, myth, and memory. The Vikings may not have left us detailed manuscripts, but they left us something far more enduring, a legacy of words that continue to inspire, enchant, and remind us of the wild, heroic age that once was. Imagine you're a Viking trader. You sail into a bustling marketplace in the heart of medieval Europe, trading your furs for silver and your lumber for fine silks. Forget about eBay. Viking trade routes were the OG international shipping companies. How far did these traders go, and what was their secret to making it all the way from Greenland to the Middle East? Spoiler, it's not just about Viking strength. The real story behind Viking trade isn't just about raids and wars, it's about about a thriving, far-reaching network of commerce that stretched across vast distances, linking disparate civilizations in ways you might not expect. Viking traders weren't the first to cross seas or establish trade routes, but they were certainly some of the most skilled and daring to do so on such a wide scale. These traders, using the same longships that brought them fame as raiders, became the middlemen in a vast commercial network that connected the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. While most people associate the Vikings with pillaging and battle, the true power of the Viking Age lay in their ability to build and maintain trade routes that stretched from the icy shores of Iceland to the bustling bazaars of Baghdad. To understand just how far-reaching the Viking trade network was, let's look at the key routes they pioneered. The Vikings didn't just hop from one island to the next. They established direct, profitable trade between regions that had previously been somewhat isolated from each other. In fact, Viking traders connected the worlds of the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Slavs, the Arabs, and even the Byzantines, bringing goods from the north to the Middle East and beyond. Let's start with the North Sea and the Baltic, where Viking trade was most prominent. Viking traders established important trading hubs in places like Birka, Sweden, and Hedeby, Denmark, which became some of the busiest markets in medieval Europe. Here, traders would exchange locally produced goods, such as furs, iron, and amber, with materials from farther south like wool, wine, and fine pottery. These were not just small transactions. Viking trade was a thriving enterprise that involved huge volumes of goods, with the Vikings acting as intermediaries between the northern and southern worlds. But that was just the start. The Vikings took to the seas in their longships, which were marvels of maritime engineering. Their shallow draft boats allowed them to navigate rivers, fjords, and open seas with equal ease. These longships weren't just about warfare. They were also the ultimate trade vehicle. The ships could carry large loads and travel long distances, and their speed allowed Viking traders to reach farther shores before their competitors. This was vital, especially when you're dealing with markets where timing and quantity could make or break a deal. One of the most impressive trade routes stretched from Scandinavia all the way to the Byzantine Empire, located in what is now Turkey. How did the Vikings manage such a feat, especially without the luxury of modern maps or navigational tools? They relied on a combination of skill, natural knowledge, and a bit of serendipity. The Vikings used the Dnieper River to travel through what is now Russia and Ukraine, where they established trade contacts with the Slavs. From there, they could trade for furs, slaves, and timber, which were highly sought after in the southern markets. These goods would eventually make their way to the bustling markets of Constantinople, where the Vikings exchanged them for luxury goods, including silks, spices, and gold. But it wasn't just the journey to Constantinople that made Viking trade so impressive. It was the sheer range of goods they carried. The Vikings were known to bring amber, hides, iron, and timber from the north to the Mediterranean. But they didn't just stop there. They also brought exotic items, such as slaves, which were a highly valued commodity in the markets of the Islamic world. The Vikings had extensive dealings with the Arabs, who valued slaves for labor, and who traded in a variety of goods that were unavailable in the north. The Vikings played an essential role in the slave trade, transporting captives taken during raids or bought from other traders. The real secret to Viking trade wasn't just the goods they traded. It was their ability to forge lasting relationships with the different civilizations they encountered. Unlike the raiders who came to plunder, Viking traders understood the importance of diplomacy and long-term business dealings. They didn't just want to make a quick profit. They wanted to establish strong trading networks that could withstand time and conflict. This was not only profitable, but it also allowed the Vikings to influence regions far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. One such example of this is the Vikings' relationship with the Anglo-Saxons. While they are often remembered for their violent raids, the Vikings also traded extensively with the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, by the 9th century, Viking trading ports had become a central part of Anglo-Saxon economy. Vikings brought silver, which was highly valued by the Anglo-Saxons, and in exchange they received textiles, pottery, and other goods. Over time, Viking traders integrated into Anglo-Saxon society, blending their goods and culture, which helped lay the foundation for the Viking Age's later political influence in England. This is where Viking trade begins to look remarkably modern. Just like today's international shipping companies, Viking traders were skilled at moving vast quantities of goods across long distances, acting as intermediaries between different cultures and civilizations. They knew how to buy low and sell high, and their commercial prowess helped them build wealth, influence, and power. By bringing goods from one region to another, they didn't just get rich, they also helped shape the economies of the regions they traded with. But how did they keep this vast network running smoothly? Well, it wasn't just about navigating long distances or trading valuable goods. The Vikings also had a knack for building strong trade alliances and maintaining them through a combination of military might and negotiation. They were both warriors and traders, and they knew how to balance the two. When Viking traders encountered difficulties, whether from hostile forces or local competition, they could call upon their Viking roots and use force to protect their interests. But more often than not, the Vikings preferred to maintain peaceful trade relationships and avoided unnecessary conflict. Now let's bring it back to today's world. If you think about the global marketplace, you can see a surprising parallel between the Vikings and modern-day companies like Amazon. The Vikings were masters of logistics. They had to be. They transported everything from everyday goods to luxury items across an immense geographical area, all while navigating unpredictable weather and unfamiliar lands. Today, Amazon does much the same thing, albeit with a bit more technology. But in essence, both systems relied on vast networks, strategic planning, and the ability to get the right goods to the right people at the right time. So next time you click Buy Now on an online order, take a moment to think about those Vikings, who, with their longships and trading skills, were the original global shipping moguls. They weren't just fierce warriors, they were savvy traders who built the world's first Amazon long before the internet existed. The Vikings didn't just raid, they built, connected, and influenced, leaving behind a legacy that not only shaped the medieval world, but laid the groundwork for global trade as we know it today. Before we dive into the sea spray and Viking ships, let's talk about the mythological fuel that powered their journeys. Thor, Odin, Loki. These weren't just gods, they were the Norse equivalent of modern-day superheroes. They gave the Vikings the courage to jump on a ship and brave the unknown, hoping to find glory, or at least a decent vacation spot. But these gods weren't just figments of imagination. They were the beating heart of Viking culture. They shaped the way the Norsemen saw the world, themselves, and their place in it. Every voyage, every raid, every conquest was influenced by the belief that their gods were watching, guiding, and sometimes even laughing at them from their heavenly halls. The Vikings weren't just fighting for riches or land. They were fighting for honor, for a place in the afterlife, and for the favor of God who might reward them with eternal glory. Thor's hammer wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of power and protection. Odin wasn't just the all-seeing god, he was the wise, all-knowing father of warriors, always watching over the battlefields. And Loki, well, Loki was the trickster, the wild card, the one who kept things interesting. Without these gods, the Viking Age might have been just a bunch of rugged men sailing from shore to shore. But with them, every journey had a sense of divine purpose, and every warrior carried with him the weight of 1,000 legends. Let's start with Odin, the chief of the gods. Odin was no ordinary deity. He wasn't lounging around on a golden throne somewhere in the clouds, sipping mead. He was the god of wisdom, war, and poetry, often depicted as a one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed one of his eyes to gain knowledge. Picture this, a god who would give up his own vision for the sake of wisdom. How's that for commitment? Odin's sacrifices weren't just limited to eyes, though. He hung himself from the branches of the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the ability to see into the future. This wasn't a god who sat around waiting for things to happen. He made things happen, often through personal sacrifice. And in a world where survival was anything but guaranteed, the idea that Odin was always watching, always ready to help guide his chosen warriors, was both reassuring and empowering. To the Vikings, Odin was the ultimate patron of warriors. If you were about to board a ship for a dangerous raid, hoping to return with riches, or at the very least an epic tale, Odin's blessing was what you sought. In battle, you weren't just fighting for gold. You were fighting for a place in Valhalla, Odin's hall of slain warriors, where you'd spend eternity fighting, feasting, and gaining strength for the final battle of the gods, Ragnarok. For the Vikings, dying in battle wasn't a tragedy. It was a mark of honor. You didn't want to just survive. You wanted to prove yourself worthy of a seat at Odin's table. With Odin as your guide, death became just another step in the cycle of life and glory. You were guaranteed an afterlife, not just for being a fierce warrior, but for being part of something greater. Then there's Thor, Odin's son, who's probably the most famous Norse god in the modern world, thanks to a certain Hollywood franchise. But long before Chris Hemsworth graced the silver screen, Thor was the god of thunder, lightning, and of course fighting. With his hammer, Mjolnir, Thor wasn't just a god of strength, he was the protector of both gods and men. When the Vikings set sail for unknown shores, they knew that Thor would be there, ready to smite anyone who dared cross their path. Thor was the embodiment of Viking strength. He wasn't just there for the quiet moments or peaceful raids. He was the one you called on when you had to face the chaos of a battle or a storm at sea. Thor's relationship with the Vikings was incredibly personal. He wasn't some far-off deity that you only heard about in distant chants. Thor was there with you in the thick of it. If you were out on the open sea and a storm rolled in, you could bet Thor was the one you prayed to for a calm breeze or a safe landing. But Thor wasn't just about physical strength. He also represented the idea of protection. He was the god who kept the chaos at bay, who ensured that the Viking longships would reach their destinations. And when a Viking warrior marched into battle, he wasn't just swinging a sword, he was channeling Thor's might, hoping that the god's power would help him strike fear into his enemies. Then, of course, there's Loki. If Thor was the protector and Odin the wise father, Loki was the mischievous trickster who kept things unpredictable. Loki was a god who could shapeshift, lie, and scheme with the best of them. He was both a friend and a foe to the gods, often causing trouble and chaos, but also helping them out of tight spots. He wasn't a warrior like Thor or a sage like Odin, but Loki had a special place in Viking mythology because he represented something important, the wild card. In a world where survival often depended on luck as much as skill, Loki's presence in Viking mythology reminded them that fate could be unpredictable. Things could go terribly wrong at any moment, and that chaos was a force as powerful as any god's hammer. Loki's role as the trickster also reflected the reality of Viking life. Life wasn't just about fighting battles or following the god's orders. Sometimes it was about outsmarting your enemies, finding clever ways to overcome obstacles, and adapting to the challenges you faced. Loki's ability to shift his form and outwit others was a reminder that even the gods couldn't always control everything, and the Vikings, too, had to be flexible and ready for anything. Together, Odin, Thor, and Loki represented the full spectrum of Viking experience. Odin gave them wisdom and guidance, Thor gave them strength and protection, and Loki reminded them that things could always change in unexpected ways. These gods weren't just mythological figures, they were practical tools that Viking warriors could turn to for strength, courage, and cunning. When you're about to set sail on an adventure, knowing that gods like these have your back can make all the difference. The influence of Viking mythology didn't end with the gods. The sagas, the great stories of Viking adventures, were filled with heroes who embodied the virtues of their gods. These heroes, like Ragnar Lothbrok, were seen as blessed by Odin, Thor, or Loki. They fought bravely, lived wildly, and died honorably, just like the gods they worshipped. The sagas tell us about a world where human action and divine will were inextricably linked, where every raid and every battle was part of a greater cosmic struggle. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, think about those Viking warriors, fueled not just by the promise of treasure or land, but by the belief that the gods were guiding them toward greatness. In their eyes, their journeys weren't just about survival, they were about joining the gods in a glorious, eternal saga. And maybe, just maybe, we can all learn a little something from the Vikings' unshakable belief that fate and fortune can be shaped by courage, wisdom, and the willingness to face the unknown with the heart of a warrior. Imagine the Vikings pulling into what they thought was the new world, only to find it already inhabited. How did these two groups, separated by continents and cultures, manage to coexist? Were there trades, alliances, or misunderstandings? Tonight we'll explore what it might have been like if Vikings and Native Americans had crossed paths in a way that wasn't just violent conflict. Because let's face it, history tends to focus on the battles, the raids, and the clashes of civilizations. But what if the story was more nuanced? What if the Vikings and Native Americans, those legendary wanderers and warriors, found common ground amid their differences? First, let's put ourselves in the shoes, or rather the boots, of the Vikings. They were a people of seafarers and explorers, hungry for adventure and new opportunities. When Leif Erikson and his crew set sail for the North American coast, what they called Vineland, they had no idea who or what they might encounter. To them, this land seemed to promise fertile soil, wild grapes, and abundant resources. But as they stepped ashore, what they found wasn't an uninhabited wilderness. It was a place already home to people who had lived there for thousands of years. These people, the indigenous tribes of North America, had developed their own cultures, languages, and ways of life long before the Vikings arrived. And while the Vikings may have thought they were the first to discover this new world, the reality was far different. These native peoples had been navigating their own landscapes for generations, thriving through hunting, fishing, farming, and complex social systems. The Vikings may have been tough warriors and expert navigators, but they were stepping into a world where their old ways of life wouldn't necessarily guarantee success. So what would happen when these two very different cultures met? Would it be all-out war, or could there have been some level of peaceful coexistence? The truth is, we don't know for sure. There's still a lot of mystery surrounding the nature of Viking interactions with Native Americans. What we do know comes from archaeological evidence, sagas, and the accounts of later explorers. And based on these sources, there's a possibility that Viking-Native American relations were more complex and varied than we tend to think. First, Let's consider the Vikings' approach to these encounters. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputation as raiders and conquerors, were also pragmatic and skilled traders. They weren't just interested in violent conquest, they sought to build relationships with the people they encountered, if for no other reason than to improve their chances of survival. After all, a successful raid was one thing, but sustaining a settlement, especially in a foreign land, required more than just fighting. It required resources, food, and allies. At Lanzo Meadows, the Vikings seem to have had some initial interaction with the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland, whom we believe were part of the Beothuk or other related tribes. Archaeological evidence suggests that there was some form of trade between the two groups. The Vikings would have had valuable items to offer, like iron tools, which could be highly desirable to the native people who would have lacked such metalworking technology. In return, the Vikings might have traded for fur, food, or other goods that would have helped them survive in the harsh Newfoundland winters. But trade isn't always as simple as exchanging goods. The two groups would have had vastly different worldviews, languages, and customs, making communication challenging. The Vikings, who had their own complex society and mythology, might have viewed the indigenous peoples as strangers or barbarians, but their pragmatic nature likely pushed them to seek peaceful exchanges rather than outright conflict. However, this doesn't mean everything was smooth sailing. Cultural misunderstandings were bound to arise. Take the idea of land ownership, for example. For the Vikings, land was something to be claimed and settled. For the indigenous peoples of North America, land was seen more as a communal resource, not something to be owned by any one individual or group. This difference in perception could easily lead to tensions. The Vikings, with their settled way of life, might have viewed the land as theirs for the taking, but the indigenous peoples, with their deep connection to the land and their own way of living on it, may have seen the Vikings as intruders or even threats. One possible source of tension was the Vikings' need for resources. The sagas hint that the Vikings didn't just trade peacefully, they also sought to control the land they had found. In fact, it's believed that the Vikings might have attempted to establish more permanent settlements beyond Lanzo Meadows, even trying to expand further into North America. If the indigenous tribes resisted this, it could have led to skirmishes. The Vikings' raids and military prowess could have been seen as aggressive, but these early encounters may not have been the bloodbaths that popular imagination tends to depict. Instead, they could have been a series of small clashes and negotiations, brief moments of misunderstanding, and occasional hostility. Interestingly, some historians have suggested that there were periods of cooperation as well. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking Native American interaction is the possibility of cultural exchange. While most historical records focus on conflict, it's possible that there was also some sharing of knowledge. The Vikings, for example, were skilled boat builders and navigators, but the indigenous peoples had their own extensive knowledge of the land, the seasons, and the resources that could be harvested from the wilderness. Perhaps in some cases, these different groups shared valuable information, how to navigate certain regions or how to hunt and gather food in the unpredictable climates of the north. Some evidence, though still debated, even suggests that the Vikings may have learned certain survival techniques from the indigenous peoples. The Beothuk, for instance, were known for their ability to thrive in harsh northern climates, and the Vikings, who had come from a similarly cold environment, may have adapted some of their methods. This exchange of knowledge, however limited, could have helped the Vikings survive in the unknown wilderness of North America. But ultimately the question remains, did the Vikings and Native Americans ever truly coexist peacefully? The answer is probably a bit of both. There were likely moments of cooperation, moments of tension, and moments of outright conflict. What is clear is that the Vikings didn't just view the indigenous peoples as enemies. They were traders, explorers, and opportunists, and they likely saw the indigenous tribes as part of the larger landscape of the world they were trying to navigate. Whether through trade or conflict, the Vikings' brief presence in North America opened the door for future interactions between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So as you lie back tonight, think about what it must have been like when the first Viking ships landed on foreign shores. Imagine two very different worlds colliding, not just with swords and shields, but with curiosity, misunderstanding, and perhaps even respect. It was a meeting of cultures that, despite all odds, left its mark on history. And maybe, just maybe, there was a little more peace than we often give the Vikings credit for. What happened to the Vikings who settled in Newfoundland? If you think they lived happily ever after, think again. This was the harshest of environments, cold, wet, and full of strange animals. As we uncover the end of the Viking settlement at Lanceau Meadows, you'll see that sometimes even the most hardened Viking can't survive the whims of nature. The Vikings, known for their resilience and seafaring prowess, found themselves up against an unpredictable foe, the North American wilderness. And as the harsh winters closed in, their settlement began to unravel like an unraveling thread in a long Viking saga. When the Vikings arrived in what we now call Newfoundland, they weren't exactly strangers to tough conditions. After all, they came from the cold and rugged lands of Greenland and Iceland, where winters were long, dark, and brutal. But Newfoundland, with its fierce winters and unpredictable weather patterns, proved to be a different beast altogether. The land was rich in resources, but also, as many settlers soon found out, unforgiving. The challenge of surviving in this new land was immense. At Lanceau Meadows, the Vikings built their settlement in the 11th century, a collection of longhouses made from timber and sod, structures designed to withstand the severe northern climate. They set about establishing a foothold in the New World, intent on trading, exploring, and perhaps even settling down for the long haul. But the land didn't roll out the welcome mat. The Vikings were up against a number of obstacles they hadn't fully anticipated. For one, the winters were far harsher than what they had experienced back home in Greenland or Iceland. In Newfoundland, the cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was life-threatening. The winters were brutally long, the temperature often plunging well below freezing. These were winters that could freeze the very wood in their longhouses, threaten their food supply, and make even the simplest tasks feel like a monumental challenge. Then there were the unfamiliar animals. The Vikings, accustomed to the wildlife of their own lands, had to contend with the strange creatures of the New World. The land was teeming with animals like moose, wolves, and bears, some of which the Vikings had never encountered before. While some of these creatures were hunted for food, others posed threats to the Vikings' safety. Imagine trying to sleep soundly in a longhouse while hearing the eerie growls of wolves in the distance, or the occasional thump of a bear sniffing around your camp. The unpredictable wildlife, combined with the wild, untamed nature of the land, made it even more difficult for the Vikings to thrive. Food also became a serious issue. The Vikings were used to a diet that included meat, fish, and grains, but the soil in Newfoundland was not as fertile as they had hoped. Farming in such a cold and remote environment proved to be challenging, and the Vikings quickly ran out of fresh food supplies. While they might have initially hoped to grow crops like wheat or barley, the short growing seasons and rocky terrain made it nearly impossible to establish any kind of sustainable farming. They were forced to rely heavily on hunting, fishing, and trade, methods that, while effective, couldn't always keep up with the harsh demands of the environment. Then there's the aspect of isolation. The Vikings had long been accustomed to living in tight-knit, isolated communities, but in Newfoundland they were on their own, far away from their support networks in Greenland or Iceland. Their settlement at Lanceau Meadows was at the very edge of the known world, with no immediate allies and few sources of trade. The isolation not only made it harder to maintain supplies, but it also wore down the morale of the settlers. When things got tough, and they certainly did, the temptation to leave and return home was always there. And perhaps most critically, the Vikings' interactions with the indigenous peoples of the region weren't as smooth as they had hoped. While there is evidence of trade between the Vikings and the indigenous people, such as the Beothuk or other native groups, the relationships were likely strained. The Vikings may have arrived with a sense of entitlement to the land, viewing it as their new home, but the indigenous peoples had already established their way of life. As time went on, the Vikings may have faced increasing tensions with the locals, which could have escalated into conflict. The sagas hint at these kinds of interactions, with some describing violent skirmishes, which likely pushed the Vikings to reconsider their position in the New World. But despite these hardships, it wasn't just local opposition that doomed the Viking settlement. The final blow likely came from the relentless brutality of the environment itself. Without the proper resources to sustain themselves over the long winters and a lack of fertile land for farming, the Vikings may have found themselves unable to continue. When food became scarce, when their shelters began to fail, and when the constant threat of wildlife, bad weather, and possible conflict with the indigenous peoples wore them down, the Vikings began to leave. Slowly, over time, the settlement was abandoned. By the time the last Viking ship sailed back to Greenland, the settlement at Lanceau Meadows had disappeared, leaving only remnants behind. A few longhouse foundations, some tools, and of course the myths and sagas of their once glorious attempt at settling the New World. The abandonment of Lanceau Meadows wasn't just a tale of failure, it was also a reminder of the harshness of the North American wilderness and the limits of Viking resilience. The settlement was short-lived, but it was a bold experiment in exploration, one that hinted at the Viking desire to expand their world and their legacy. The harsh conditions of Newfoundland, though, proved too much, even for the Vikings, who had already proven themselves masters masters of the seas and capable of settling harsh lands like Greenland and Iceland. In the end, nature had the final say in their fate. In some ways, the end of the Viking settlement at Lanceau Meadows can be seen as a curse of the North, an environment that, no matter how resilient the settlers were, ultimately claimed their dreams of establishing a foothold in the New World. The cold, the isolation, the wildlife, and the poor agricultural conditions all contributed to the demise of their brief presence in North America. It was a stark reminder that even the fiercest warriors could not always conquer nature's whims. So as you close your eyes tonight and think about the Vikings' adventure in Newfoundland, picture them braving the wild, cold terrain, standing against forces far beyond their control. Imagine the endless dark winters, the frozen winds cutting through their fur-lined coats, and the quiet, stubborn persistence that kept them going for as long as they did. The Vikings may have ultimately left, but their story in the New World is one of ambition, struggle, and survival, a chapter of history where even the most hardened warriors couldn't win against the relentless forces of nature. Let's think about this. No GPS, no compass, just the open sea, and a group of fearless Norsemen setting off for a land they couldn't even see. How did they do it? This wasn't just some hope for the best adventure. These Vikings knew exactly how to navigate the ocean using the stars and even the sun's position. Tonight, let's unlock the secrets of their nautical skills. Because, as we all know, getting lost at sea today is stressful enough, even with our smartphones and satellite navigation. But back in the Viking Age, when they set sail across the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, there was no map app to point them toward the nearest harbor. Instead, they relied on a blend of observation, tradition, and an intimate understanding of the natural world to guide them through the vast, unknown seas. Imagine it, a longship cutting through the waves, its sleek hull riding the choppy waters as the Viking crew prepares for yet another oceanic journey. With no compass, no digital charts, and no modern instruments, how did these intrepid explorers know which way to go? The answer lies in the Vikings' exceptional skill in celestial navigation. They weren't just winging it. They were expert seafarers with a deep understanding of the environment around them, honed through generations of experience. One of the key techniques Vikings used to navigate the seas was their knowledge of the stars. The North Star, also known as Polaris, played a pivotal role in their navigation methods. By observing the position of the North Star in the night sky, Vikings could maintain a sense of direction. Polaris sits nearly directly above the North Pole, which made it a reliable indicator of true north. If you were a Viking sailing across the North Sea, you could look up at the sky, find the North Star, and know that, as long as it stayed in the same spot, you were heading in the right direction. But it wasn't just the North Star that the Vikings used. They also had an extensive knowledge of the night sky, understanding how different constellations appeared at various times of the year and at different latitudes. They knew that certain constellations were visible at different times of the night or year, so their ability to read the stars was far more intricate than just finding one point in the sky. For a Viking, a night journey across the open sea was an exercise in interpreting the sky's hidden messages, figuring out the position of stars, the way the moon looked, and how to track their movements across the vast ocean. The sun, of course, was another crucial element in Viking navigation, especially when they were sailing during the day. Vikings didn't just rely on the stars at night. They had strategies for navigating by the sun as well. On clear days, they could use the sun's position in the sky to estimate directions. In fact, there's evidence that Vikings used a device known as a sunstone, or sunstones, a special type of crystal, to help them find the sun's exact location on cloudy days. The sunstone worked by polarizing light, basically filtering out glare, allowing the Vikings to pinpoint the sun's position even when it was obscured by clouds or fog. Imagine sailing through thick clouds, only being able to see faint hints of sunlight, but still knowing exactly where to head. This ability to navigate without perfect visibility was a game-changer for the Vikings, allowing them to make their way across the ocean even when conditions were less than ideal. But the Vikings didn't just look to the sky. They also had a remarkable understanding of the sea itself. One method they used to navigate involved using the set of the sea, or the direction in which the ocean currents flowed. Vikings would observe how the water moved around them, how the waves behaved, and which way the currents were pushing. By understanding these natural patterns, they could make informed decisions about their course, adjusting their sailing technique to make the most of the ocean's forces. This wasn't just guesswork, it was an accumulated knowledge passed down from one generation of sailors to the next, refined through years of trial and error. Additionally, the Vikings would also use landmarks and coastal navigation, when they were close enough to land. When they sailed along coastlines or approached islands, they would look for distinctive features, mountains, cliffs, or other natural formations that they could recognize from the sea. These landmarks served as vital reference points, guiding them safely toward landfall or helping them keep their bearings when they were navigating narrow fjords or coastal waters. But despite these impressive methods, Viking navigation wasn't foolproof. The open ocean was still a dangerous place, and the Vikings faced many challenges during their voyages. They didn't always have the luxury of clear skies or calm seas. They had to rely on their instincts, experience, and sometimes pure luck. In many ways, the Vikings were pioneers in oceanic exploration, charting new routes and establishing connections across vast distances without the modern tools we take for granted today. The Vikings also had another key advantage: their ships, longships, the sleek, versatile vessels that became the trademark of Viking exploration, were designed for both speed and flexibility. Their shallow drafts allowed them to sail through coastal waters and even up rivers, making it easier for the Vikings to navigate various types of terrain. The longship's design was ideally suited for their style of navigation, fast and adaptable, able to handle both open ocean and inland waterways. These ships weren't just built for raiding and battle, they were built for exploration, enabling the Vikings to traverse vast stretches of open water with confidence. So how far did Viking navigational skills take them? Well, the answer is quite far indeed. They reached the coasts of Greenland, Iceland, the British Isles, and even North America, all by relying on their profound knowledge of the sea, sky, and the world around them. The Viking voyages to Newfoundland, led by Leif Erikson, are particularly remarkable because they show just how far the Vikings were willing to travel in search of new lands and opportunities. Without the aid of modern technology, they managed to cross the Atlantic, one of the most challenging and vast bodies of water in the world, and establish the first known European settlement in North America. The Vikings didn't just wander aimlessly through the oceans. They were skilled, confident, and capable seafarers, using the natural world as their compass. Their voyages, powered by a combination of celestial navigation, environmental awareness, and seafaring ingenuity, took them to some of the farthest reaches of the known world. They didn't have GPS or modern navigation tools, but they had something perhaps even more valuable: a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the natural forces that shaped their world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those fearless Vikings setting sail across the vast ocean with nothing but their knowledge of the stars, the sun, and the sea to guide them. With no map to follow, they relied on their instincts, their observations, and their centuries of seafaring tradition to navigate the unknown. Their voyages are a testament to human curiosity, determination, and the belief that there's always a new horizon just waiting to be discovered. So, the next time you're lost, think about those Vikings who got across an entire ocean without the luxury of a smartphone, and maybe find a little bit of inspiration to trust your own instincts, even when the way forward isn't so clear. Viking sagas are legendary, literally. These stories, passed down through generations, paint a picture of Vikings as epic heroes, slayers of monsters and conquerors of lands. But what's the real story behind these sagas? Were these events blown out of proportion, or is there some truth behind the tall tales? Tonight, let's peel back the layers of myth and explore the real stories behind the Vikings' greatest adventures, filled with blood, bravery, and maybe a little embellishment. When we think of Viking sagas, we imagine grand tales filled with gods, giants, and epic battles. Take the saga of the Volsungs, for example. It tells the story of Sigurd, the dragon slayer, who embarks on a journey to defeat a fearsome dragon named Fafnir, claiming the hoard of treasure guarded by the beast. It's a gripping tale of heroism, betrayal, and revenge. But did Sigurd really slay a dragon? Or was this story a colorful exaggeration of real events? Was the hoard of treasure as magnificent as described? Or is that just the saga's way of glorifying Viking feats? These sagas, often written centuries after the events they describe, were as much about legend building as they were about recording history. The sagas were written down long after the Viking Age had ended, mostly in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries. By this time, the world had changed dramatically. The Vikings, who had once sailed across Europe, raided towns, and discovered North America, were no longer the wild seafarers they had once been. They had settled into a more stable society, and the oral tradition of storytelling was in full swing. The sagas became a way to connect with their past, preserving the glory and the heroism of their ancestors, but they were also stories designed to entertain and inspire. Most of the sagas we have today were written by Icelandic monks, who were likely tasked with preserving the heroic deeds of their people. These monks, though educated and literate, didn't always stick to the strictest rules of historical accuracy. Their job wasn't just to report the facts, it was to tell a good story, one that would capture the imagination and inspire generations to come. As a result, many of the sagas include elements of fantasy and mythology. Gods intervene in battles, supernatural creatures appear, and fate itself seems to guide the heroes. But just because the sagas are full of fantastical elements doesn't mean they're completely fictional. Embedded in these larger-than-life tales are kernels of truth. The events described in the sagas often have a basis in real history. For example, the saga of Eric the Red recounts the story of Eric's exile from Iceland and his subsequent journey to Greenland, where he established the first known Viking settlement. While the saga's details, like Eric's colorful personality or the dramatic way he claimed Greenland, might be exaggerated, the overall story is historically accurate. Eric the Red really did discover Greenland and establish a settlement there, and his son, Leif Erikson, is believed to have been the first European to set foot in North America. However, the sagas often took liberties with time, space, and character details. For example, the Vikings were known for their brutal raids on monasteries and towns across Europe, yet their depiction in sagas as chivalrous warriors, bold and righteous, righting wrongs, was likely influenced by the desire to elevate their status. The sagas were written at a time when Viking raids had already ended, and the Icelanders were no longer fighting in the same ways. By romanticizing the past, the sagas preserved the Vikings' image as fearless warriors, proud of their heritage and capable of tremendous feats of valor. Another key element of Viking sagas is their heavy focus on fate and destiny. Many of the sagas depict heroes who are bound by fate, living and dying according to forces beyond their control. This wasn't just a poetic device. It reflected a deep-seated belief in Viking society. The Norsemen believed that the gods controlled fate and that their lives, in many ways, were predestined. This worldview permeates the sagas, where heroes often seem to fight against inevitable outcomes, struggling to carve their names into history even as they are inexorably drawn toward their fate. Take the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most legendary figures in Viking sagas. The sagas depict Ragnar as a near-mythical hero who led daring raids and eventually met a dramatic end at the hands of King Aelle of Northumbria. Was Ragnar Lothbrok a real historical figure? Possibly. Did he lead the legendary raids and meet a grisly death by Snake Pit? That's a bit murkier. Some historians argue that Ragnar was likely based on several real Viking leaders rolled into one larger-than-life figure, with the saga authors weaving together bits of truth, myth, and imagination. What we can say for sure is that the name Ragnar and the idea of a great Viking warrior became so deeply embedded in the saga tradition that his legend would forever live on in the collective consciousness of the Viking world. But let's not forget the role of Loki, the trickster god, in Viking mythology and sagas. Loki's antics, causing mischief among the gods, causing chaos in the human world, were often exaggerated, but they also reflected the unpredictability of Viking life. The sagas used Loki's character to remind their audiences that not everything was as simple as a straight path from point A to point B. Life was full of twists, turns, and the occasional well-timed trick. This wasn't just an abstract philosophical idea. It was the reality that Vikings faced as they navigated the dangerous world of raiding, trading, and settling in foreign lands. The sagas also helped cement the values of Viking society: bravery, loyalty, revenge, and honor. These tales weren't just for entertainment, they were a reflection of the ideals that the Vikings held dear. A good Viking warrior wasn't just strong or skilled in battle. He was also honorable, willing to fight for his family, his people, and his gods. The sagas taught future generations what it meant to live and die as a Viking, not just in battle, but in life. They were a way of passing down the cultural DNA of Viking society, ensuring that the next generation understood the sacrifices and virtues that defined them. So, did the sagas exaggerate the truth? Yes, but they didn't completely fabricate it. While the larger-than-life adventures and supernatural feats might be embellished, the core stories of Viking exploration, conquest, and survival have a foundation in real history. The sagas offer a glimpse into the Viking psyche, revealing their fears, their triumphs, and their enduring belief in the power of fate. These stories, shaped by centuries of oral tradition, may have been stretched to the limits of imagination, but they still carry the essence of the Viking spirit, a spirit that is as alive today as it was 1,000 years ago. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think of the sagas, the tales of brave warriors, fabled gods, and epic journeys. While the dragons and gods may not have been real, the courage, honor, and quest for glory were. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little bit of the Viking spirit in all of us, still chasing our own legends. The Vikings weren't all just bloodthirsty raiders with axes. Behind every successful Viking man was often a Viking woman holding the fort at home. But what did life look like for Viking women, especially those living in a settlement like Lanceau Meadows? Were they just caregivers, or did they wield real power and influence? Tonight, let's take a look at the unsung heroes of Viking society, the women who, while often overshadowed by their male counterparts in history books, played a pivotal role in keeping Viking society running and thriving. When we think of Vikings, we tend to picture them as fearsome warriors, sailing off into the unknown, raiding distant shores, and establishing settlements. But while the men were off conquering, what were the women doing? The truth is, Viking women weren't just sitting around waiting for their husbands or brothers to return. They were incredibly resourceful, strong, and essential to the survival of Viking communities, particularly in remote outposts like Lanceau Meadows. In Viking society, women had a surprisingly high status compared to other contemporary societies. While they were certainly not equals to men in the sense of holding the same political or military power, they had significant influence within their households and communities. Women could own property, manage households, and, importantly, make critical decisions when men were away. When a Viking man set out on a journey or raid, whether it was across the sea to England or into the wilderness of Greenland, it was often the women who kept things running at home. They were the ones overseeing the farms, maintaining trade relations, and ensuring that the family's wealth was preserved. Let's take a closer look at what Viking women's daily lives might have looked like. In settlements like Lanceau Meadows, women would have been responsible for a variety of tasks that were crucial to the survival of the community. Running a household in such a harsh environment was no small feat. While the men were busy with exploration or trade, the women were maintaining the homes, caring for children, weaving textiles, and preparing food. Women were skilled in arts such as weaving wool and flax to create clothing and textiles. These weren't just simple garments, they were practical, built for the cold, with fur-lined coats and thick woolen tunics. Women were also the primary caregivers, of course, but their role went far beyond simply looking after children. They were responsible for everything from preserving food through drying and salting, to managing livestock, milking cows, and gathering wild herbs for medicine. In the harsh winters of Newfoundland or Greenland, this work was especially important for ensuring that the community could survive the long, isolated months without outside supplies. Without the resourcefulness of Viking women, the men would have had a much harder time surviving the conditions that made their voyages so legendary. But Viking women weren't just skilled caretakers. They were also trusted leaders in their own right. While the men were away raiding or exploring, it was often up to the women to take charge in their absence. This didn't just mean running the household, but also managing matters of law and order within the community. The Viking legal system, known as the Thing, was a public assembly where important decisions were made, and women could have a say in some cases. In fact, some sagas suggest that women could be lawyers in Viking society, presenting their cases and arguing in court for justice. These legal powers weren't necessarily the same as those held by men, but they were significant enough to make Viking women influential figures within their communities. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking women's roles was their influence in matters of marriage and family. While it's often assumed that Viking marriages were arranged, the sagas tell a different story. Women had a strong say in their choice of a spouse, and it was not uncommon for them to refuse unwanted suitors. In some cases, women had the power to divorce their husbands, an almost unheard of freedom in many societies at the time. If a Viking woman found herself unhappy in a marriage, she could bring a case before the Thing and legally dissolve the union. This was a radical concept in a world where women's rights were often secondary to those of men. Additionally, Viking women were expected to be skilled in the law and traditions of their people. The sagas, passed down through generations, were often recited by both men and women. Women were seen as keepers of the stories, the legends of the gods and heroes that defined Viking culture. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were a way of preserving the history, values, and beliefs of the Viking world. To be a Viking woman was not just to maintain the hearth, but to ensure that the traditions of the past lived on through oral storytelling. But let's talk about the Vikings' travels and what role women played when they were away from home. For Viking women in settlements like Lanceau Meadows, the reality was that men would often spend long periods at sea, either on raids, trading expeditions, or exploring new lands. This created an environment where women had to be incredibly independent and self-sufficient. In some cases, women were tasked with overseeing expeditions or making decisions about resources while the men were gone. Imagine being in charge of a settlement in a foreign land, where every day was a battle for survival and the harsh winters were just as dangerous as the unpredictable seas. It wasn't just about holding the fort, it was about keeping the Viking legacy alive when the men were absent. While women at home were managing households, there were also some Viking women who played active roles in Viking expansion. In some sagas, we hear of women like Lagertha, a shield maiden who fought alongside her husband, Ragnar Lothbrok. Though these stories are sometimes treated as legends, there is evidence that some women did indeed fight, especially in the early Viking raids. These women were not simply spectators. They were warriors, leaders, and rulers in their own right. In the Viking world, it wasn't unthinkable for a woman to wield a sword or make strategic decisions during a raid. Viking society, as rugged and brutal as it was, allowed for more flexibility in gender roles than many of its contemporaries. When we think about the Vikings in popular culture, we often picture the warriors in longships, the gods on Mount Olympus, and the thrilling tales of battle and conquest. But it's crucial to remember that behind every great Viking man was often a great Viking woman, someone who helped make those tales possible, who ensured that the community survived and thrived in even the harshest conditions. Women were not just bystanders in Viking society, they were its backbone, shaping the future through their strength, wisdom, and ability to endure. As you settle in for the night, think about those women of Lanceau meadows and beyond, standing firm in the face of a harsh and unpredictable world, keeping the Viking flame alive in ways we often overlook. They may not have wielded the axes or sailed the longships, but without them, the Viking world would have been far less enduring. The Vikings weren't all just bloodthirsty raiders with axes. Behind every successful Viking man was often a Viking woman holding the fort at home. But what did life look like for Viking women, especially those living in a settlement like Lanceau meadows? Were they just caregivers, or did they wield real power and influence? When you think of Vikings, you might picture them gnawing on meat and washing it down with a hearty gulp of mead. But what else did these Northmen eat? How did they survive in the brutal climates of the north? And what food secrets did they have to get through the harsh winters? The truth is, Viking cuisine was much more varied and resourceful than the simple image of horned helmets and roasted boar. The Vikings were expert hunters, farmers, fishers, and preservers of food. They needed to be, given the harsh northern environments they called home. In a land where winters could last for months, food wasn't just a luxury, it was a matter of survival. Let's start with what we know about the basics of a Viking diet. The Vikings, like many peoples of the time, had a diet that was heavily dependent on what was available to them in their immediate environment. This meant that their food choices were shaped by the seasons, the terrain, and the animals that roamed the land. The Vikings were master hunters, and meat was certainly a large part of their diet. Game like wild boar, elk, reindeer, and deer was commonly hunted, and domesticated animals such as cows, sheep, and pigs were also raised. This might sound like a meat lover's paradise, but it wasn't just about piling meat onto a plate. The Vikings were incredibly resourceful and knew how to make the most of their food. For example, the Vikings didn't just eat meat, they ate the entire animal. This wasn't about waste. When a Viking hunter brought home a boar, for example, they would use every part of it, meat, bones, organs, and all. The meat would be roasted, salted, or smoked, but the bones and fat weren't tossed aside. Bones would be carved into tools, and animal fat could be used for cooking or even for lighting lamps. The organs were often considered a delicacy. Viking feasts were not just about meat, they were about resourcefulness, making the most of every piece of the animal. But what about vegetables, you ask? Surely the Vikings didn't live on meat alone. Well, you're right. Vegetables and grains played a crucial role in their diet, especially in the colder months when fresh meat might be scarce. Vikings grew a variety of crops, including barley, oats, rye, and wheat. These grains were used to make bread, porridge, and ale. Yes, ale was practically a staple. Root vegetables like carrots, onions, and turnips were also commonly grown, as they could withstand the cold and be stored for the long winters. In fact, the Vikings' ability to grow and preserve food was essential for surviving the harsh northern winters. They didn't have the luxury of fresh produce year-round, so preserving food was a skill that helped them make it through those long, dark months. And speaking of preservation, the Vikings were experts at keeping food fresh through methods like salting, pickling, and fermenting. Salt was a vital commodity for the Vikings, not only for seasoning but for preserving meat and fish. They would salt large amounts of fish and store it for winter. This was particularly important for communities living along the coast or near rivers, where fish was a primary food source. The Vikings' access to salt, often acquired through trade, helped them ensure that they could eat well even during the colder months when fresh food was hard to come by. Fermented foods were also an essential part of the Viking diet. One of the most famous of these was sauerkraut, made from cabbage that was fermented with salt. This method of food preservation not only helped the Vikings survive the winter months, but also provided a healthy source of probiotics, which were important for digestion in the days before modern medicine. In addition to fermented vegetables, the Vikings also fermented dairy products. Skyr, a thick yogurt-like substance, was a common dairy product among the Norse. It was easy to store and provided much-needed nutrition during the colder months when fresh milk was not available. The Vikings also had a rich tradition of fishing. With their superior boats and navigational skills, they were able to fish in the seas around their homeland, as well as in the rivers and lakes. Fish, especially herring, was a staple food, and it wasn't just eaten fresh. The Vikings dried, salted, and smoked fish to preserve it for later use. Herring, in particular, was so abundant that it was a key part of the Viking economy, and it helped feed not only the Viking families but also their trade partners. Dairy products were another important food group for Vikings, and their use of dairy extended beyond just milk. Butter, for example, was commonly made, both for eating and for preserving meat. Viking butter was sometimes even used as a form of currency or traded for other goods. Cheese, too, was a valuable commodity. In a society where traveling long distances was the norm, having access to portable and easily preserved foods like cheese and butter was incredibly important. Let's not forget about beverages. While mead gets the most attention, the Vikings also enjoyed ale, which was brewed from barley, water, and yeast. Ale was consumed in great quantities, not just for celebration, but as an everyday drink. It was safer than drinking water, which was often contaminated, and it provided necessary calories in a world where food security was a constant concern. The Vikings would often brew their own ale at home, and it would be served at feasts, accompanied by stories, songs, and laughter around the fire. So was the Viking diet all about hearty stews, roast meats, and mead? Not exactly. While these foods were certainly important, the Vikings ate a varied and nutritious diet, especially considering the challenges of living in such harsh climates. They made the most of the food sources available to them, whether that meant hunting game, fishing, farming, or preserving food for the winter. In many ways, the Viking diet was a testament to their ingenuity and resourcefulness. They knew how to turn what nature provided into sustenance for both the body and the spirit. And let's not forget the importance of food in Viking culture. Feasts were a time for storytelling, bonding, and honoring the gods and the fallen. Food was more than just fuel. It was a way to connect with one's ancestors, tell the stories of battle and adventure, and celebrate life. A Viking feast wasn't just about the meat or the mead. It was about building a sense of community and ensuring that the Viking way of life would continue even after death. So the next time you think of Vikings, picture them not just as fierce warriors, but as skilled cooks, ingenious preservers, and hearty eaters who made the most of what the land and the sea gave them. Their food wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, in a world where every meal was hard-earned, and every bite was a small victory. And tonight, as you settle in to sleep, think about the Vikings, sitting around their fires, sharing stories and bread, and living to eat another day in a world that demanded nothing less than resilience and creativity. Let's face it, the Vikings were tough, but nothing could have prepared them for the brutal winters and unpredictable storms that seemed to have it out for them. We'll explore how the elements may have been just as much of an enemy as the indigenous peoples or other Viking clans. The Vikings were renowned for their seafaring skills, their bravery in battle, and their ability to conquer new lands. But even the most fearless warriors couldn't outwit the wrath of nature. The weather, whether in the freezing winds of the north or the violent storms of the open seas, was a force that tested their limits, often pushing them to the brink of survival. Living in the northernmost parts of Europe, the Vikings were no strangers to harsh conditions. Their homelands in Scandinavia, especially in Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, were known for their long, dark winters and unpredictable weather. Yet they were a people who thrived in these conditions. Viking settlements were often built with the cold in mind, with their sturdy, timbered longhouses designed to withstand the snow and ice. They wore clothing made from wool and fur, which kept them warm in the harshest of conditions. But even with their rugged adaptability, the Vikings could not escape the brutal power of nature. Let's start with the infamous Viking winters. If you've ever lived through a harsh winter, you know the toll it can take on both body and mind. But imagine enduring months of cold, with little daylight, freezing temperatures, and snow piling up in endless heaps. That was the reality for Viking settlers. While we often think of the Viking Age as a time of endless adventure and conquests, many of the Vikings' most significant challenges came during the Winter months when food became scarce and survival was at its most difficult. The long winters in places like Greenland and Iceland were especially harsh. Temperatures often plunged far below freezing, and the sun barely rose above the horizon for weeks on end. The Vikings had to rely on their ingenuity to survive these frozen months. They had to preserve food, salted meats, dried fish, pickled vegetables, and store enough supplies to last until spring. The darkness and coldness of winter were not just physical challenges, but psychological ones as well. Imagine living in a world where the sun never fully rises, and the cold permeates every inch of your home. Yet the Vikings persevered. Their society was built on resilience, and during those long winters, it was that resilience that kept them alive. The Vikings' ability to survive harsh winters was also due in large part to their skill in building strong, insulated homes. Their longhouses, which could house entire families, were constructed from wood and sod, keeping in warmth from the hearth and blocking out the cold. But no matter how skilled they were at constructing their homes, the weather could still take a toll on their lives. Heavy snowstorms could isolate settlements, preventing trade or communication between communities for weeks. This isolation often meant that in the event of a disaster, such as a crop failure, a raid, or an illness, there was no help to be had. The Vikings were entirely dependent on their ability to endure nature's whims. If the winter was particularly harsh, they could face starvation, disease, or even complete abandonment of their settlements. But the Vikings didn't just face the harsh winter months. They also had to contend with the unpredictable and often deadly storms at sea. When they set sail for new lands, they were sailing into the unknown. The Vikings were expert shipbuilders and navigators, but even they could not predict the fury of the open ocean. The North Atlantic, in particular, is infamous for its violent storms, which could change from calm to catastrophic in a matter of minutes. Viking longships, though remarkably sturdy and fast, were designed for coastal waters and rivers, not for navigating the treacherous open ocean. The Vikings' success in their seafaring ventures depended on their ability to read the weather and adapt quickly. A sudden storm could not only wreck a ship, but it could also strand the crew in unfamiliar and often hostile territory. The Vikings were skilled at reading the natural signs of the weather. They used the clouds, the wind, and the color of the sea to predict when a storm might be coming. But as anyone who has ever sailed knows, weather doesn't always cooperate with predictions. When storms did hit, the Vikings relied on their ship's superior design to get them through. The longships' shallow drafts allowed them to travel along coastlines, avoiding some of the more dangerous open waters. But when caught in a storm out in the middle of the ocean, the Vikings had to rely on their navigation skills and their sheer will to survive. A particularly famous example of Viking resilience in the face of a storm comes from the Saga of the Greenlanders, which tells the story of Leif Erikson's voyage to North America. Leif's crew was caught in a ferocious storm while attempting to reach Vinland. The saga describes how the storm nearly destroyed their ship, and yet, through sheer determination and skill, Leif and his crew managed to stay afloat and eventually reach the shores of what is now Newfoundland. This story, like many others, speaks to the Viking ability to endure, to navigate through chaos, and to trust their instincts when faced with danger. While these storms and harsh winters were a constant challenge, they also shaped the Viking way of life in ways that many people don't often consider. The Vikings weren't just warriors and explorers. They were also incredibly skilled survivalists. They had to be. Every day was a battle against nature, and every successful raid, trade, or exploration was not just a victory over other people, but a victory over the elements. They didn't conquer the world by brute force alone. They conquered it by understanding the forces of nature, by working with it, and sometimes by simply enduring it. And it wasn't just the cold and the storms that challenged them. The unpredictable landscape of the north, rocky shores, freezing waters, and dense forests made settling in places like Iceland and Greenland a risky business. These lands were far from hospitable, and their inhabitants had to be adaptable. The Vikings made use of the few resources available to them, including the rich marine life of the North Atlantic. But even this had its limits. A poor fishing season, a failed crop, or an unusually harsh winter could spell disaster. The Viking settlements, especially those in Greenland, faced constant threats from the harsh environment. It wasn't just the indigenous peoples or rival Viking clans that could endanger their survival. It was the very land they had chosen to call home. Despite all of these challenges, the Vikings managed to carve out a life in some of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Their ability to survive and thrive in the face of constant adversity speaks to their resilience and resourcefulness. They were warriors, explorers, and traders, yes, but they were also masters of survival, capable of navigating and enduring the most brutal conditions that nature could throw their way. As you drift off tonight, think about the Vikings, braving the fiercest storms and the coldest winters, pushing through when it seemed like nature itself was against them. Their lives weren't just about battle, They were about living to fight another day in a world where nature's unpredictability was just as dangerous as any enemy. Before they discovered North America, the Vikings were busy conquering the seas of Europe. Their legendary raids on England, France, and even parts of Russia are well known. How did these sea kings rise to power, and what made them so successful at plundering the coastlines? Tonight, let's take a deeper look at the origins of these infamous warriors, the rise of Viking chieftains and kings, and the secrets behind their unmatched success in dominating the seas. While the Viking Age is often remembered for its violent raids and conquests, there was much more at play than just bloodshed. The Vikings didn't just plunder, they built their power, crafted alliances, and navigated both the seas and the intricacies of medieval politics to create an empire that spanned much of Europe. The roots of Viking power can be traced back to the early medieval period, a time of shifting political and social structures in Scandinavia. In these northern lands, mainly modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, society was built around tribal communities. Each tribe was ruled by a chieftain, a warrior leader, who commanded respect not just through battle prowess but through his ability to rally people around a common cause. These early leaders weren't kings in the sense we think of today. They were more like powerful lords with loyal followers, leading raids to gain wealth and prestige. The first Viking sea kings came from these tribal communities. They weren't born into royal bloodlines in the way European monarchs were. Instead, they earned their titles through conquest, charisma, and cunning. One of the most famous early Viking chieftains was Harald Fairhair of Norway, who is credited with uniting various smaller kingdoms into one powerful realm by force, laying the foundation for the Viking rise in the region. Harald's rise wasn't just about winning battles, it was about consolidating power through marriage, strategic alliances, and crucially, control over the best coastal territories. These lands gave him direct access to the seas, which was essential to Viking success. For the Vikings, control of the sea meant control of trade, raiding routes, and ultimately political power. Once these Viking leaders consolidated their power in Scandinavia, they began to look beyond their borders, and that's when the real sea king phenomenon took off. The Vikings were exceptional seafarers, and their longships were the most advanced vessels of their time. These ships, with their shallow drafts and flexible, lightweight designs, could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowing them to travel to distant lands with remarkable speed and precision. The Vikings didn't just sail, they explored. They used their ships to raid the coasts of Europe, but they also used them to trade, settle new lands, and establish strongholds in distant regions. The vastness of the seas became their empire, and it wasn't just about plundering villages, it was about controlling the waterways and building connections across a huge swath of land. But why were the Vikings so successful at this? It wasn't just because they had the best ships, though that certainly helped. The Vikings also had a distinct military culture that emphasized both ferocity and efficiency. Viking warriors were not just skilled in individual combat, they were also adept at organizing and executing complex raids. Viking raids weren't random acts of violence, they were strategic, well-planned, and often executed with military precision. When the Vikings targeted a village or monastery, they didn't just show up, pillage, and leave. They scouted their targets, chose the best time to strike, and in many cases took advantage of the element of surprise. By attacking quickly, they could overwhelm defenders and escape before local forces could retaliate. This efficiency made the Vikings incredibly difficult to stop. Moreover, Viking leadership was built around the concept of loyalty and reward. The Vikings didn't just raid for the sake of chaos, they raided for treasure, but more importantly, to gain power. The spoils of these raids were used to strengthen the leader's position. A successful raid would mean wealth for the chieftain, which he could use to gain the loyalty of warriors. These warriors, called herdmen, were elite fighters who pledged their loyalty to a specific leader in exchange for land, goods, or a share of the plunder. This relationship created a culture where success in battle directly translated into more power. The Viking king or chieftain's ability to share wealth with his followers ensured their loyalty, which in turn secured his position as leader. As Viking leaders grew wealthier from these raids, they could expand their influence. They began to form alliances with other powerful families and rulers, and these alliances often involved the exchange of goods, land, and even marriages. The Vikings didn't just conquer, they assimilated. For example, when Viking leaders like Rollo of Normandy settled in modern-day France, they made strategic alliances with the local Frankish nobility, ultimately becoming integral parts of the region's ruling class. Rollo's descendants became the Dukes of Normandy, playing a key role in the future of European history. Similarly, Viking kings in England, like King Svein Forkbeard, took advantage of internal strife to claim power. The Vikings were masters of using both force and diplomacy to build their empires. The Viking presence in places like England and France wasn't just about plunder, it was also about establishing a lasting impact. For the Vikings, success on the battlefield wasn't the end of the story. They were also farmers, merchants and settlers, and many of the Viking leaders who raided the coasts of Europe went on to establish permanent settlements. These settlements were more than just outposts. They were thriving communities where Norse customs and culture flourished. The Vikings didn't just conquer territories, they shaped them, often leaving behind a legacy that would last for centuries. One of the key factors in the rise of the Viking sea kings was their ability to adapt and evolve. Unlike many other cultures of the time, the Vikings were not just warriors, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their ability to diversify their activities allowed them to create a network of influence that stretched from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, and even into Russia. Their power was not just built on raids, it was built on relationships, both with other Viking clans and with the people they conquered or traded with. So what ultimately made the Viking sea kings so successful? It wasn't just their prowess in battle, though that certainly helped. It was their ability to control the seas, their network of alliances, and their skill in blending force with diplomacy. They were fierce warriors, but they were also shrewd politicians, merchants, and settlers. Their legacy as sea kings isn't just about the battles they won, it's about how they shaped the lands they touched, and how their impact still echoes in the modern world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the Viking sea kings, not just as warriors with axes, but as visionaries who understood the power of the sea, the importance of alliances, and the value of blending strength with strategy. These leaders didn't just build kingdoms, they built lasting empires that stretched across the waves. Their success wasn't just about plundering, but about creating something enduring. Imagine stepping onto the battlefield dressed in leather, fur, and chainmail, wielding a mighty axe. That's the Viking way. Tonight, we'll explore the weapons and armor the Vikings used to ensure they became the feared warriors of their time, and how these items played a role in their discoveries, both in war and exploration. From their razor-sharp blades to their iconic shields, Viking weaponry wasn't just about fighting, it was about making a statement. These weapons, combined with their fearsome reputation and seafaring prowess, made the Vikings one of the most formidable forces of their era. So let's dive into the arsenal of a Viking warrior and discover how these tools of battle helped them carve out an empire across Europe, the British Isles, and beyond. First, let's talk about the Viking axe, the weapon most closely associated with these legendary warriors. You've probably seen a Viking wielding one in movies, TV shows, or comics. But what made the Viking axe so effective, and why did it become the weapon of choice for so many warriors? The Viking axe was designed for both combat and practicality. It wasn't just a symbol of brute strength, it was also a highly functional tool. The most common type of Viking axe was the hand axe or battle axe. These axes had long wooden handles that allowed for powerful strikes, and their heads were often double-edged, making them ideal for both cutting and thrusting. What made the Viking axe especially dangerous was its versatility. The design of the axe allowed for quick, fluid movements. Vikings could wield their axes with one hand or two, depending on the situation. In battle, they could strike with a single blow, cutting through shields, armor, and bone. But the axe was also a practical tool outside of battle. A Viking warrior could easily chop wood for fire, clear brush, or even help build their longships. The axe became a symbol of Viking resourcefulness and toughness, traits that were just as important in exploration as they were in battle. Of course, no warrior is complete without a proper sword, and the Vikings had some of the best swords of the medieval period. Viking swords, known for their distinct and elegant designs, were forged from high-quality steel, making them not just tools of war, but also works of craftsmanship. Viking swords were typically long and double-edged, designed to deliver powerful strikes that could cut through armor. The Vikings were known to have a special technique for forging these swords, which included folding the metal repeatedly to create a strong, flexible blade that would withstand battle after battle. Some swords even featured intricate decorations, with hilt designs made from gold, silver, or iron, often showing off the craftsmanship of the blacksmiths who forged them. But Viking swords weren't just about their appearance. They were a reflection of the importance of swordsmanship in Viking culture. To wield a sword was not only to be skilled in battle, but to be part of the warrior elite. Viking swords were passed down from generation to generation, sometimes becoming family heirlooms that carried great significance. The sword was a symbol of honor, a key piece of a warrior's identity, and a tool used in everything from the fiercest battles to ceremonial rituals. Shields, too, played an important role in Viking warfare. But the Viking shield was not just a defensive tool, it was an extension of the warrior's identity. Viking shields were round, made of wood and reinforced with a metal boss in the center. They were light enough to be wielded with one hand, allowing warriors to keep their other hand free for weapons like axes or swords. Viking shields were often brightly painted with patterns, symbols, and even personal markings. These shields were not only functional in battle, where they helped block blows from enemies' swords and axes, but they also served as a statement of strength and identity. When you saw a Viking warrior standing in a shield wall, their brightly colored shields forming an almost impenetrable barrier, it wasn't just a display of military might. It was a display of Viking unity and resolve. In fact, the shield wall was one of the Vikings' most effective battle tactics. By standing shoulder to shoulder, forming an almost solid line of shields, the Vikings could turn the tide of a battle with coordinated precision and brute force. While the Vikings were exceptional with their axes, swords, and shields, they also employed a variety of other weapons, each suited to different types of warfare. For example, the spear was one of the most common weapons among Viking warriors. Spears were versatile, cheap to produce, easy to carry, and effective at both range and close combat. A Viking warrior would throw a spear to strike enemies from a distance, or use it in hand-to-hand combat, where it could be used for thrusting. Some Viking spears were also designed with long, wide tips, making them even more effective at piercing armor or shields. The spear was one of the most democratic of Viking weapons, as it was used by both elite warriors and common foot soldiers alike. But Viking warriors didn't just rely on weapons, they also relied on their mastery of combat techniques. The Vikings were known for their brutal fighting style, which combined quick strikes, heavy blows, and a deep understanding of the battlefield. They fought with ferocity and precision, using their shields not just for defense but as offensive tools to push their enemies off balance. The Viking combat style was often chaotic and fast-paced, with warriors charging headlong into battle, axes and swords swinging in every direction. Their technique of fighting in a shield wall, where warriors would lock shields together to form a nearly impenetrable front, allowed them to push through enemy lines while maintaining cohesion and strength. And then there was the armor. While the Vikings were often depicted in movies wearing full chainmail and helmets, the reality was that Viking armor was much simpler. Many Viking warriors wore basic leather or woolen clothing reinforced with bits of metal known as ringmail. The higher status warriors might have worn chainmail, which was made from interlocking rings of metal, providing greater protection in battle. Helmets were also worn by Viking warriors, but contrary to the horned helmet stereotype, Viking helmets were typically simple, rounded iron or steel caps designed for maximum protection, without any of the flamboyance often seen in modern depictions. The practical nature of Viking armor, combined with the warriors' reliance on mobility and agility, allowed them to move quickly during raids or battles. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were master craftsmen and tacticians. Their weapons and armor weren't just tools for combat, they were symbols of their identity, their culture, and their connection to their gods. In battle, the Viking warrior was an embodiment of the values of Viking society: courage, honor, and strength. When these warriors set sail, axes in hand and shields raised, they weren't just seeking treasure or conquest. They were living out the stories of their ancestors, fulfilling their destiny as warriors under the protection of the gods. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself stepping onto the battlefield as a Viking warrior, armed with your axe, sword, and shield. Picture the chaos of battle, the clash of weapons, and the unwavering courage of the warriors around you. With every swing of the axe and every strike of the sword, you're not just fighting for victory, you're fighting to carve your own legend, just like the great Viking heroes of the past. What did the Vikings really leave behind? It's not just their long ships, their sagas, or their ruins. It's a cultural imprint, a way of living, a set of skills that helped shape the world. Let's dive into the lasting influence of Viking culture and how they're still remembered today. When most people think of the Vikings, images of fierce warriors sailing across stormy seas and pillaging foreign shores come to mind. But the true legacy of the Vikings stretches far beyond their reputation as fearsome raiders. The Vikings didn't just leave behind fear and devastation, they left a cultural and societal footprint that shaped Europe in ways that are still felt today. Their influence can be seen in everything from language and governance to trade and exploration. Let's explore the ways in which the Vikings despite their relatively short reign of terror and conquest, continue to impact the world centuries after their time. One of the most enduring legacies the Vikings left behind is the influence they had on the European and North American landscape. Viking settlement wasn't just about raiding, it was about colonizing and adapting. As they moved across Europe and beyond, they established towns, trading hubs, and even royal dynasties. The Vikings were instrumental in forging connections between distant parts of the world, and their trading routes spanned from North America to the Middle East. By setting up these settlements, they ensured that their influence would be felt long after their longships left the shores. In what is now the United Kingdom, the Vikings left their mark in the form of the Danelaw, an area of England that was ruled by Viking law and culture. The Vikings who settled in this region brought with them their own system of governance, which emphasized the importance of local assemblies called things. These gatherings were where Viking freemen came together to resolve disputes, make decisions, and ensure that the rules of their society were upheld. In this sense, Viking law and governance had a lasting impact on the legal systems of Britain, influencing everything from property rights to the role of the individual in the community. In fact, many of the place names in England today, such as York, Leeds, and Manchester, are remnants of Viking settlement, showing just how deeply their culture became embedded in the fabric of Britain. Perhaps one of the most profound ways the Vikings influenced Europe was through their contributions to trade and economy. The Vikings were skilled traders, and they opened up new routes that connected the northernmost parts of Europe with the Mediterranean, Asia, and the Islamic world. The Viking trading network was vast, encompassing goods from furs and timber to fine silk and spices. The city of Dublin, for example, became a key hub in this trade, founded by the Vikings as a bustling marketplace where goods from around the world were exchanged. As a result, Viking influence helped lay the foundations for the emergence of a more connected and globalized world. But the Vikings didn't just trade goods, they traded knowledge. The Vikings were not only seafarers, they were also skilled craftsmen, engineers, and builders. The longship, their most iconic creation, revolutionized naval architecture. The Vikings were the first to build ships that were fast, lightweight, and capable of navigating both shallow waters and open seas. This innovation allowed them to strike swiftly and move with unparalleled agility, but it also paved the way for the development of better ships throughout Europe. The Viking longship design influenced the creation of ships in both Europe and the Middle East for centuries, allowing for advancements in navigation and maritime trade. Beyond their practical contributions, the Vikings also left a rich cultural legacy that has survived in art, literature, and language. Viking sagas, those epic tales of heroism, exploration, and adventure, continue to capture the imagination of people today. Written down long after the Viking Age, these sagas provided a way to preserve Viking history, beliefs, and cultural values. They are more than just stories of battles and treasure. They are windows into the Viking worldview, where fate, honor, and family were paramount. The Vikings' love of storytelling was so important to their culture that even their oral traditions contributed to the richness of Norse mythology, which has become an indelible part of Western literary tradition. But let's not forget that the Vikings were not just warriors and explorers. They were also highly skilled farmers and builders. Viking society was built around the family farm, where men and women worked together to produce food, raise animals, and maintain their homes. Viking architecture, particularly in the form of longhouses, was designed to provide shelter and warmth during the long, cold winters. These longhouses were built with wooden beams, sod, and stone, and many are still standing today, giving us a glimpse into the ingenuity of Viking craftsmanship. Their buildings were functional, but they were also designed with an eye for efficiency, allowing for both living and storage space under one roof. The Vikings' understanding of architecture helped them thrive in harsh climates, and their methods of construction influenced building techniques in the regions where they settled. Language is another area where the Vikings' influence is still felt today. Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings, left an indelible mark on the languages of the countries they invaded. English, in particular, has borrowed a great deal from Old Norse, with thousands of words and phrases having Viking origins. Everyday English words like window, husband, and knife come from Old Norse, as do many place names across the British Isles. In addition, the Vikings introduced a variety of new customs, laws, and social structures, all of which contributed to the development of the modern societies in which we live today. The Vikings also brought with them a deep connection to the gods and spiritual practices that shaped their lives. Norse mythology, which recounts the adventures of gods like Odin, Thor, and Loki, has been passed down through generations. Today, Norse mythology continues to influence modern literature, movies, and and even video games. The portrayal of gods, heroes, and mythical creatures in popular culture draws directly from Viking stories, proving that the Vikings' spiritual and mythological legacy is alive and well. And who could forget how the iconic imagery of Viking helmets, shields, and the godly figures has captured the collective imagination through modern media. It's not just the warriors we remember, their gods and legends live on. Yet perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the Viking legacy is the cultural fusion they facilitated. In every land the Vikings touched, they didn't just conquer, they merged with the people they encountered. They traded, intermarried, and learned from the cultures they came into contact with. Over time, this blending of traditions, beliefs, and customs created a richer, more diverse cultural landscape across Europe and even into parts of Asia. The Vikings were not just conquerors, they were cultural connectors, forging links between distant parts of the world that otherwise might never have been connected. As you settle in for the night, think about the Vikings' legacy. It wasn't just about their raids, their ships, or their battles. It was about the lasting impact they had on the societies they touched. From the language we speak to the places we visit, from the stories we tell to the beliefs we hold, the Vikings left their mark on the world in ways that continue to shape our lives today. So the next time you hear a tale of Vikings, remember, it's not just the fearsome warriors or the glittering treasure that made their legacy. It's the ways in which their culture continues to echo through the centuries. How far did the Vikings really go? Most people think of them only as raiders of the British Isles, but the truth is much more impressive. They traveled across the known world, reaching as far as the Mediterranean and possibly even North America. Let's explore the full extent of their journeys. The image of the Viking as a bloodthirsty raider is deeply ingrained in popular culture, but in reality the Vikings were far more than mere pillagers. They were explorers, traders, and settlers, pushing the boundaries of their world in ways that few could have imagined at the time. The Vikings' legacy isn't just built on their military conquests, it's also built on their unparalleled exploration of distant lands, their ability to navigate vast oceans, and their establishment of networks that spanned continents. To truly understand the scope of Viking exploration, we have to begin with their ability to build some of the most advanced ships of their time, the longships. These sleek, shallow-draft vessels were the key to Viking success on both land and sea. The longships were fast, maneuverable, and capable of traveling in both open seas and narrow rivers. This versatility allowed the Vikings to sail to places no one else could reach, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the icy waters of the North Atlantic. With their longships, the Vikings could raid coastal villages one moment and travel deep into foreign territories the next. Their ships weren't just instruments of war, they were the tools of exploration, allowing them to forge new routes, establish settlements, and open up trade networks. The Vikings' maritime prowess enabled them to travel much farther than most people realize. One of their most impressive feats was reaching the Mediterranean. While we often associate Viking raids with northern Europe, the Vikings sailed south to Spain, France, and Italy. The Mediterranean was a bustling hub of commerce and culture, and the Vikings, known for their aggressive raids, didn't hesitate to plunder cities like the famous Santiago de Compostela in Spain. However, the Vikings didn't just raid, they also traded, and their trading expeditions took them into the heart of the Mediterranean world. The city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, was a key destination for Viking traders. The Vikings established contact with the Byzantine Empire and even served as mercenaries in the Byzantine army known as the Varangian Guard. These interactions helped the Vikings acquire luxury goods such as silks, spices, and silver, which they brought back to the northern lands, further strengthening their trading routes. The Vikings didn't stop there. They reached deep into the heart of Russia, making their way along the Volga River and into the very lands of the Slavs. This region, known as Rus, was named after the Vikings who settled there. It's from these Viking settlements in the east that we get the name Russia. The Vikings didn't just pass through, they established strongholds, built cities, and created a lasting legacy in the region. Their interactions with the Slavic peoples were a mix of trade, diplomacy, and sometimes conflict, but over time the Vikings integrated into local societies, leaving behind a blend of cultures that would shape the future of Eastern Europe. Perhaps the most surprising and awe-inspiring aspect of Viking exploration was their journey to North America. Leif Erikson's famous voyage to what he called Vinland, which is now believed to be located in Newfoundland, marks the first known European landing on the North American continent, centuries before Christopher Columbus. While this discovery is often overshadowed by later European exploration, the Viking presence in North America is a testament to their navigational and exploratory skills. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon the coast of North America. They did so after an arduous journey across the North Atlantic, navigating by the stars, the sun, and whatever other means they had at their disposal. Leif Erikson's landing in North America was not a one-time occurrence either. The Vikings made several expeditions to the New World, establishing temporary settlements like the one at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland. But their exploration wasn't just limited to the Americas. The Vikings traveled to Greenland, Iceland, and even the Arctic regions, reaching as far north as the shores of what is now Canada. In fact, evidence suggests that the Vikings were the first Europeans to set foot in North America. However, their settlement at Vineland was short-lived, and the reasons for their departure remain a subject of debate among historians. Some speculate that the harsh winters and difficult conditions in North America were too much for the Vikings to handle, while others believe that conflicts with the indigenous peoples of the region led to their abandonment of the settlement. Regardless of the reason, their voyages to North America remain one of the most extraordinary feats of exploration in the medieval world. Closer to home, the Vikings also traveled extensively within Scandinavia, expanding their territories from their homelands in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They were not only seafarers and traders, but also fierce warriors who used their ships to raid and conquer lands along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, France, and even parts of modern-day Spain. The Viking invasions of the British Isles in the 8th and 9th centuries are some of the most well-documented events in Viking history. They established kingdoms in England, such as the Danelaw, and influenced the course of English history. The Vikings were also responsible for founding settlements in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, further solidifying their presence in the British Isles. What's particularly striking about Viking exploration is how they were able to maintain these vast networks of travel, trade, and settlement across such a wide area. Their ability to navigate the seas with precision and skill was unparalleled for their time. The Viking longships allowed them to travel swiftly and with great agility, whether they were crossing open oceans or navigating narrow rivers. Their understanding of geography, tides, and winds was advanced, and their voyages were meticulously planned, even if they didn't have modern navigational tools. While the Vikings were known for their raids, it's crucial to remember that they weren't simply pillagers. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers who used their longships to build bridges between different cultures and regions. They established trade routes that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, connecting distant parts of Europe and the Middle East. They also left behind a legacy of language, place names, and cultural practices that continue to influence the world today. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those Viking explorers, braving the unknown, crossing vast seas without the comforts we have today. Their daring voyages and their ability to navigate the globe shaped the course of history and made them one of the most remarkable civilizations of their time. The Vikings didn't just conquer. They discovered, traded, and built a lasting legacy that continues to echo through the ages. Whether they were sailing across the Mediterranean, raiding the coast of England, or setting foot in North America long before Columbus, the Vikings truly expanded the boundaries of the known world. Behind the Viking warrior image lies a strict code of honor and loyalty that shaped their society. Tonight we'll explore how the Vikings navigated their daily lives, from family roles to loyalty to their chieftains, and how these values shaped their journey to Lanceau Meadows. The fierce image of the Viking as a wild, bloodthirsty warrior is certainly part of the story, but it doesn't tell the full picture. Beneath the violent raids and seafaring adventures lay a deep, intricate set of values that governed Viking behavior. These values weren't just about fighting, they were about family, loyalty, honor, and duty. These principles were woven into the very fabric of Viking society and were integral to their success, their travels, and their interactions with both their own people and the world at large. At the core of Viking society was the concept of honor. This wasn't just a personal virtue, it was the bedrock of social interaction and the foundation of every Viking's reputation. Honor governed everything, from how you treated your family to how you fought in battle. A man's honor was his most prized possession, and his actions were judged by how well he upheld this code. Honor was closely linked to one's reputation, which could make or break a Viking's standing in society. The Vikings were a warrior society. Much of their honor was earned through bravery in battle, loyalty to one's kin and chieftain, and a commitment to the collective good of the group. It was a world where individual honor wasn't just about personal pride. It was about preserving the integrity of one's family, clan, and tribe. In Viking culture, honor could be gained or lost with a single act. A failure in battle or a dishonorable action could result in shame not only for the individual, but for the entire family. This sense of collective responsibility was reinforced by the Thing, the Viking assembly, where important decisions were made and where matters of honor were often discussed. This public forum ensured that anyone who acted dishonorably was subject to scrutiny and would be held accountable for their actions. In a society where everyone knew each other's reputation, one dishonorable act could tarnish a Viking's name for generations. Connected to honor was loyalty, both to family and to leaders. Loyalty was a vital element of Viking society, and it was expected that family members would support each other no matter the circumstances. Viking families were tight-knit units, often living and working together in communal longhouses. The family bond wasn't just an emotional connection, it was a matter of survival. Viking warriors were expected to defend their family's honor, protect their land, and defend their community. Loyalty to one's family was paramount, and no Viking would hesitate to go to great lengths to defend their kin against enemies, whether they were other clans or outside invaders. This deep familial loyalty extended beyond blood relatives. It was about supporting those who shared the same values and lived by the same code. But loyalty didn't just stop with family. Loyalty to one's chieftain was also crucial. The Vikings weren't just a scattered group of individual warriors. They were bound by loyalty to their leaders. A Viking's connection to his chieftain or king was vital, and in return for loyalty and service, the chieftain was expected to reward his warriors with land, treasure, and the spoils of raids. This relationship was symbiotic. Warriors fought for their leaders, and leaders provided for their warriors. The bond of loyalty between a Viking and his chieftain was ironclad. If a Viking's chieftain called upon him to fight, the warrior was duty-bound to answer. It was this loyalty that formed the backbone of Viking military campaigns and made the Vikings such a formidable force. Without this deep-seated loyalty to their leaders, the Vikings would not have been able to conquer as much land, nor would they have been able to expand their influence across Europe. In a world where loyalty was so integral to survival, betrayal was one of the most heinous acts a Viking could commit. A traitor, someone who turned on their family or chieftain, was seen as the lowest of the low. This wasn't just about breaking a promise, it was about shattering the very foundation of Viking society. Betrayal was often punished severely, with traitors being cast out of their communities, their names erased from history. The Vikings had a code of justice that was swift and brutal, and betraying one's own was something that could not be forgiven. But while the Vikings were fiercely loyal to their families and leaders, their society was also built on the importance of community. The Viking way of life was deeply communal. The Viking longhouse, the center of every family's home, was a symbol of this shared existence. Multiple generations of a family would live together in the longhouse, working together to ensure their survival. Every Viking had a role to play, whether it was in farming, trading, crafting, or fighting. This collective effort was crucial for the survival of the family and the success of the clan. The bonds within the longhouse were built on trust, respect, and mutual support, values that were essential for Viking society to thrive in the harsh conditions of Scandinavia and beyond. The concept of honor was also closely linked to the idea of fame and legacy. A Viking's reputation was often carried on through storytelling, through the sagas passed down to future generations. These stories weren't just for entertainment, they were a way of preserving the names of great warriors, chieftains, and explorers. A Viking could achieve immortality through the tales told about him, his deeds immortalized in songs and sagas that would be recited by future generations. In a world where much was uncertain, the desire to be remembered, to have one's name live on, was a powerful motivator, and this drive for fame, for a legacy of honor and loyalty, shaped the Vikings' ambition and their desire to explore, conquer, and establish their place in the world. As the Vikings made their journey to Lanceau Meadows, their code of honor, loyalty, and family played a central role. It wasn't just a quest for land or treasure, it was a pursuit of legacy. They didn't just sail across the seas for the thrill of discovery, they sailed to establish their families and their culture in new lands. They knew that to survive, they needed to build a community rooted in the very principles that had made them successful at home. In a harsh and unforgiving world, the values of honor, loyalty, and family were the glue that held Viking society together, propelling them forward as they set sail to new horizons. So tonight, as you rest your head, think of the Vikings, their sense of honor, the loyalty they pledged to their families and leaders, and the strong ties that bound them to their community. These principles guided them on their raids, their journeys, and their discoveries. It wasn't just about battle or bloodshed, it was about a way of life, a code of conduct that shaped everything they did. The Vikings were more than warriors. They were a people driven by an unshakable belief in honor and loyalty, and those values helped them carve out a legacy that would last for centuries. The Vikings didn't stick around forever at Lanceau Meadows. But why? What caused these brave adventurers to abandon their North American outpost, leaving it to be rediscovered centuries later? Tonight, let's tackle one of the biggest questions about Viking exploration. Why did the Vikings leave North America? Lanceau Meadows, located in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, stands as the only known Viking settlement in North America. It was a key outpost in the Viking quest to explore and conquer new lands, but after only a few decades, it was abandoned and its existence was lost to history until it was rediscovered in the 1960s. The reasons behind the Vikings' decision to leave remain a mystery that has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and explorers for centuries. Was it due to harsh conditions, conflicts with indigenous peoples, or perhaps the Vikings' desire to focus on other pursuits? Let's dive into the most plausible explanations for the Vikings' sudden departure from North America. One of the most obvious and perhaps simplest explanations is the harsh environment of Newfoundland itself. Despite the Vikings' skill in surviving in some of the harshest climates in Europe, the environment in North America was undoubtedly challenging. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was located in a remote northern region, subject to long, bitterly cold winters with short summers. While Greenland and Iceland, the Vikings' other known outposts, were cold, Newfoundland presented its own set of difficulties. The land was not as fertile as the Vikings had hoped, and the climate was even more unpredictable, with frequent storms and harsh winters that could make survival difficult. The Vikings were master seafarers, but in their settlements they relied heavily on farming and fishing for sustenance. In Newfoundland, the soil was not as suitable for farming as they had expected. The growing season was short, and crops likely failed more than once, making it hard to feed an entire community, especially during the long winters. They may have started out with high hopes of a fruitful settlement, but the reality of the environment may have made them question whether staying was worth the struggle. With limited resources, it's possible that the Vikings simply found it too difficult to maintain the settlement and decided to leave in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Beyond environmental challenges, there was also the lack of resources that might have contributed to their decision. The Vikings had a strong culture of trade, and part of their reason for exploring new lands was to find valuable resources such as timber, iron, and furs. However, it seems that Newfoundland didn't offer the wealth of resources the Vikings needed to thrive. While there were certainly fish and timber, the region may not have been as rich in resources like those in Greenland or Iceland, where they had established more prosperous colonies. In Greenland, for example, the Vikings thrived on farming, hunting, and trading with Europe. By contrast, the resources in Newfoundland may not have been enough to sustain a settlement in the long term. Given the reliance on trade and self-sufficiency, the Vikings might have concluded that the cost of maintaining a settlement in Newfoundland outweighed the benefits. Another plausible reason for their departure is conflict with indigenous peoples. While early interactions between the Vikings and the indigenous peoples of North America, such as the Beothuk, were likely marked by trade and occasional cooperation, it is possible that tensions arose over time. The Vikings were not known for their diplomatic finesse, and their tendency to view other cultures through the lens of conquest and superiority may have led to conflict. The indigenous groups in Newfoundland were well adapted to the environment, with deep knowledge of the land and its resources, and they likely saw the Viking settlers as a threat to their way of life. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings and indigenous peoples may have had several encounters, some of which may have turned violent. The sagas mention skirmishes between the Norsemen and the indigenous people, with descriptions of the natives resisting Viking encroachment. These conflicts could have made the Vikings reconsider their presence in the region. After all, the Viking ethos placed a great deal of importance on survival and family. If relations with the local populations deteriorated to the point where the settlers no longer felt safe or able to maintain the settlement, leaving might have been the only option. There's also the theory that the Vikings simply moved on to new opportunities. The Vikings were explorers at heart. Once they had set up a base in Newfoundland, they may have felt the pull to venture even further. Leif Erikson's expedition to North America was not the only Viking journey. The Vikings were constantly pushing the boundaries of the known world, always seeking out new lands to settle or plunder. Perhaps the Vikings left Newfoundland simply because they had more ambitious plans. The shores of North America were only a stop on their extensive exploration route. The lure of new lands and the promise of greater riches, perhaps even in the form of trade with other indigenous groups further south, could have enticed them to leave. Additionally, the Vikings had established settlements in Greenland, which may have become a more viable long-term option. By moving back to Greenland, they could have maintained their established communities and continued to trade with Europe. Greenland offered a more predictable environment, despite its own harsh conditions, and provided a greater sense of security and stability for the settlers. It's possible that the Vikings simply decided to consolidate their resources and focus their efforts on strengthening their position in Greenland, where they had more established infrastructure and trade routes. Lastly, the internal dynamics of Viking society might have played a role. Viking society was deeply hierarchical, with a strong emphasis on loyalty to one's chieftain and the need to prove oneself in battle. A Viking leader's power was often measured by the wealth and success of his campaigns, and if the settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows wasn't yielding the desired results, it might have been seen as a failure. In Viking society, a failed settlement or venture could lead to a loss of respect and influence, both for the leader and for the community as a whole. Faced with the pressure to succeed, the Vikings may have abandoned the settlement and moved on, possibly to focus on more lucrative ventures or to reclaim their honor in more familiar lands. So why did the Vikings leave L'Anso Meadows? It's likely a combination of factors that led to their departure. The environmental challenges, the lack of resources, potential conflicts with indigenous peoples, and the Vikings' innate desire to explore and conquer new territories all played a part in the decision to abandon the settlement. While the exact reasons may never be fully understood, one thing is clear: the Vikings didn't just fail in their North American endeavor. They left a legacy of exploration, resilience, and bold ambition. Their presence in North America may have been brief, but it was a significant moment in history, one that showcases their far-reaching impact on the world. Tonight, as you rest, think of the Vikings, their audacity to venture into the unknown, their drive to conquer new lands, and their unwavering commitment to exploring every corner of the world. So as you snuggle into your warm bed tonight, think about those Viking adventurers, the ones who set sail with no GPS, no weather apps, just their ironclad ships and the sheer audacity to think they could conquer the unknown. As you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate just how much easier we've got it now. Indoor plumbing, warm blankets, and the luxury of not worrying about marauding parties in the middle of the night. History might have been a rough, cold, and slightly ridiculous place, but it was also full of people who refused to give up, no matter how harsh the conditions. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in with all the comforts of the modern world, maybe whisper a little thank you to your Viking ancestors who braved the elements, built strange little outposts in places where no sane person would, and maybe even invented a few things that changed the course of history. Because as wild as those Viking days were, it's proof that people, no matter how unprepared or slightly unhinged, can accomplish the extraordinary. And with that, I'll let you rest, knowing that you're far more comfortable than a Viking at L'Anso Meadows ever could have been. Sweet dreams, my friend.